I stand here and reflect upon this conference. I'm reminded that almost 30 years ago, we had our first conference at the Sheraton Commander Hotel. It was a very brief sort of conference, one evening. But the first time a group of scholars came together and discussed a subject of importance in the field of Armenian studies. In the span of some 30-odd years that have taken place since, there have been countless conferences that NAASR has sponsored and that other organizations have sponsored. But this is the first one that deals with our American Armenian community. In terms of our community here, it's probably the most important one. For we hope at the end of these 2.5 days, we will learn something about our community, its problems, pattern of settlement, and hopefully from this we'll get some ideas and lessons for the future. For those of us who are Armenians, of course, one of the most important things is that the Armenian heritage continues, not only in books, not only in academic circles, but also in terms of people, in the people themselves. And I'm sure that all of the speakers will have words of wisdom for us, regardless of what their subject matter is. My task today, at this moment, is just to open this conference, extend these greetings of welcome, and to read to you a couple of telegrams that we received today. The first one reads as follows. Kitty and I thank you for extending an invitation to attend the National Conference on Identity and Assimilation, the Armenian Experience in America. Unfortunately, previous scheduling commitments prevent us from joining you, but we do want to express our gratitude to those of you who joined us last week in commemorating the Armenian genocide and the Jewish Holocaust during the ceremonies at the State House. In the past few years, a great deal of public attention has been paid to the plight of the Armenians, the pains they have suffered, and the great strides they have made in this century. We are very fortunate that so many varied and rich ethnic groups have chosen to emigrate to this nation. And your conference on identity and assimilation will help reinforce the valued contributions that the Armenian people have made to America. Our best wishes for a successful conference. Governor Michael S. Dukakis. The other telegram that arrived today is from the opposite end of the country, and it reads as follows. It gives me great pleasure to convey my regards as you hold your national conference. A knowledge of our heritage helps to let us know who we really are and provides us with direction. Your conference should not only lead to a deeper understanding of that heritage, but also give us strength for the future. Best wishes to all. Most cordially, George Dekmejian. The one other thing that I would like to do before turning the meeting and the conference over to those who will be running it is to inform you of who the members of the conference planning committee have been. During the period of almost a year that we have been planning this conference, we've had a committee of 6 people who have been working very diligently, and this is the fruit of their effort. That committee has consisted of Handlin, when he was still here in the Boston area. Only recently he got a job in Washington and had to leave this area. Dr. Hrair, Dr. Robert Mirak, Dr. Robert Thompson, Rafael Yayan, who was the conference coordinator, and myself. And we met many times in the span of the last year, and I would say that a great deal of the success of this conference has to be attributed to the chairman of the committee, Dr. Mirak. He has fulfilled his responsibilities as chairman without any shirking of responsibility, taking on all necessary tasks that a chairman should take on. And I hope the future chairmen of other committees and other conferences will follow the example of Bob Mirak. So without much further ado, I would like to call upon Bob to carry on with the point.
Ladies and gentlemen, I should like, first of all, to welcome you on behalf of the NAASR Conference Committee to this first ever conference on the Armenian experience in America. We've worked long and hard, as Manoog has said, on the conference. We hope you will find it interesting and provocative. I myself am particularly pleased with the conference for a number of reasons. First, that we've been successful in attracting a number of distinguished scholars in many fields, from history, political science, literature, music, and anthropology, to discuss a score of important topics on the Armenian-American experience. We're familiar with the scholars' backgrounds. We feel confident that papers will contribute a good deal to the rapidly emerging field of Armenian-American studies. But I am also pleased with the conference because of its theme. You know that NAASR has encouraged scholars and scholarship in many fields of Armenian history. Whether that scholarship was involved with 5th century Armenia, or the medieval period, or the ancient church, it was important to our understanding of our distant past and culture. But scholarship can and also should deal with the present and the culture we live in. After all, the critical importance of scholarship is that it informs our lives and helps us to understand better who we are and who we shall be. So, what better use for research by qualified scholars than to talk about political and artistic aspects of culture in the United States campaign? And that cultural community now is 1 year old. It's in the third and fourth generation of Armenian Americans. And insofar as we seek to preserve what our ancestors brought to this country, we need to know what have been the major patterns of social, economic, and political life in the various communities in North America. Moreover, in the past 20 years, a new community from Soviet Armenia and the Middle East has settled in the New World, and it has produced its own share of problems of adjustment with the host country and with the Armenians who have been here since World War I. So we certainly need inquiry, research, and understanding of our society, and the scholars assembled here for this conference are well qualified to inform and educate us. As I said at the outset, we have worked long and hard on the conference, and I should like now to thank a number of individuals who helped in bringing it about. First, my thanks to the NAASR staff, and especially to Mrs. Sandra Dekmejian, who did such a superb job of getting the materials out, calling the meetings, keeping track of the 1,000 details, and generally administering the specifics of the conference. Also, I want to express my appreciation to the members of the conference committee, whom one has just named. These include Mr. Young, whose idea the conference was, and who as usual did a superb job in organizing. To Mr. Rafi Yehyayan and to Professor Robert Thompson, Marshall Professor of Armenian Studies at Harvard, who were extremely helpful in putting together the conference over the many months since we began. And finally, to Dr. Martin Halabian and to Gregory Handlin, who put in useful part-time service. Certainly the conference could not have succeeded without their able assistance. Tonight's session on the conference theme of identity and assimilation opens our deliberations. It is my distinct pleasure now to introduce its chairman, who is also the honorary chairman of the entire conference. Oscar Handlin is perhaps best known for his pioneering works in American social history, especially on immigrant and ethnic groups. His seminal works have brought him such awards as the American Historical Association's Dunning Prize for Boston's immigrants and the Pulitzer Prize for The Uprooted. And his other works, which cover 15 pages of fine print, have brilliantly illuminated virtually every aspect of American history, society, and education from the 17th century to the present. In addition to this, Mr. Handlin was one of the principal editors of the Harvard Encyclopedia of American Ethnic Groups He's been editor of the Library of American Biography, which runs to over 25 volumes. He served first as the director for the Center of the Study of the History of Liberty in America, then on the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History, both at Harvard. He has served as the director of the Harvard University Press, and he has just completed an important phase as director of the Harvard University Library. And for these contributions to scholarship and to the university, Harvard has awarded him a series of professorships, the latest of which was announced last week, the distinguished Carl M. Loeb University Professorship. But this is not all. In addition, Mr. Handlin has been one of the most prolific directors of PhDs in history, and according to the latest count, over 70 Harvard PhDs were completed under his supervision. Educator, scholar, university administrator, he has always had the time as well to listen to a student's question and to give advice to young men and women in the profession. And he has been very charitable with his efforts whenever NAASR has asked him. It is a pleasure again to have him with us this evening. Professor Handlin.
Thank you, Bob. Ladies and gentlemen, after that kind of introduction, one is almost tempted to respond with wordy discourse that would somehow live up to the encomium in the introduction. But my role is just to preside over this session, and I'm not sure anyway that I have anything more to say about this subject, which occupied me for a long time, but which I've left to younger and fresher and more imaginative scholars in recent years. It's interesting that these reputations should linger, because the book to which Bob Mirak referred were written 25, 30, 85 years ago. They're an interesting part of the bibliography, and only the first 2 pages or so. And someday, I hope, people will leaf over to the books on other subjects, some of which are yet to come. But it is encouraging in reading a subject like this to see how much still is being done, and being done in ways that the scholars of my generation could not even imagine. And so it's very nice to me to emerge back into this realm of subject and to consider the topic, which is still vital, still important, identity and assimilation, a problem which confronts the Armenians, which is other ethnic groups in the United States. The first speaker this evening is an old friend. He's not as old as I am, but he's a friend of long standing. Must be almost, not quite 40 years ago, that I ran into him first when he was one of the editors of Commentary magazine in a different era. And then later, I remember, he and Pat Moynihan came to see me when they were about to write a book on the ethnic groups in New York City. And we talked about that subject. The results of their efforts produced a notable volume, which is still important, still being read. And then events occurred, and our speaker moved from Berkeley to Cambridge, which brought him somewhat closer. his interest in ethnicity persisted, and succession of important work has expressed his results and interpretations of this process. So Nathan Glazer of the Harvard University comes to address us first on American perspectives on the problem of identity and assimilation.
Thank you, Oscar, and the proceeding. I suppose I have been less successful than Professor Handlin in escaping from ethnic issues. I've made my foray, but the issues seem like Proteus. They keep on recurring in different forms. New questions seem to be raised all the time. Things that we thought were settled are not settled. I recall that in 1965, when we passed the new Immigration Act, we figured that we'd settle that question for a while. It turns out, if you read the newspapers, that we definitely did not. Going back further, in the 1920s, we passed another act, and we thought we had settled the composition of the American population for the future. Well, we had not. So there have always been new things to talk about. The topic you have set me, and that I tried to respond to, is a difficult one, and particularly difficult for what I may call ethnic advocates. America is not kind to them, and I will explain why. It's not kind to them, in fact, because in a way it's too kind to them. Let me begin with a story from France, where I spent some time last year and discovered there was a great deal of concern that French culture was being overwhelmed by Americanization. Common problem. It seems American culture is very attractive, and not only to immigrants to the United States, but to people in developing countries or to youth in communist societies who feel unfairly deprived of genes and Michael Jackson. It was also considered a threat, at least by many people, in the center of what is truly a great culture with a strong international influence, that of France. In the course of that debate, I read an article on what is wrong with the French novel, in which the writer tries to explain why it doesn't have the kind of worldwide influence and appeal that the American novel does, or, he gives another example, the Latin American novel does. The problem, the critics sadly report, is that nothing very interesting happens in the French novel. If someone dies, it is generally out of boredom or in an automobile crash. Pondering his analysis, I thought he was right. American novels are interesting, or can be interesting, because terrible things have happened or are happening. Blacks are lynched, slaves are brought, the South is ravaged by a terrible civil war, immigrants come and live under difficult conditions, life in the great cities is threatened because of crime, corruption, racism. I do not agree with those who think everything is wrong with the United States. We can make a much fuller catalog of what is wrong with Latin America. And perhaps for that reason, Latin American novelists keep on producing those terrible, phantasmagoric stories and keep on winning Nobel Prizes overtaking even American novelists. But it is true, compared with France, many other countries who are sufficiently open, mixed, undisciplined, disorganized, to permit rather more interesting novels than the harmonious and less divided and less disordered culture of France. Troubles mean cultural vitality. They also mean a sharper and more strongly maintained ethnic identity. And that brings me to the topic of our meeting and the paradox I will explore in this talk. The maintenance of ethnic and racial identity in the United States is challenged by the very success of the measures to achieve equality and fairness that all ethnic and racial groups fight for. Jews did not have to worry about ethnic identity in Tsarist Russia. The Irish did not have to worry about ethnic identity in Ireland. The Armenians did not have to worry about ethnic identity in Turkey. Indeed, the very term identity probably didn't exist. It wasn't necessary. There was no or very little element of choice about it. One was what one was born, and one suffered the consequences of prejudice and discrimination in discriminatory law, ultimately conceivably in death. The problem of ethnic identity in America is the problem of a society that becomes increasingly tolerant, increasingly indifferent to ethnic identity, and then finally comes to see it as an attractive component of variety in a world in which everything becomes too much alike. When ethnicity is patronized rather than seen as a threat, and that I think is the situation in America, the problem of maintaining loyalty to an ethnic group, pride in it, commitment to its institutions, becomes increasingly difficult. Ethnic identity in a multi-ethnic society of immigrants such as our own, it seems, can only be maintained in its fullest form by the kind of troubles we prefer not to have, and which we have indeed overcome. As a result, in talk about ethnicity and race, identity is a late starter, a very late phenomenon. It only arises in situations where it's threatened by tolerance. There are too many other things to worry about if one is a minority and a persecuted minority to boot that seem and are more important than identity. There's livelihood, educating one's children, safeguarding one's existence from economic and political threat. These take up much of the energy of immigrants, and a full flowering of educational and cultural institutions has to await a later time when a measure of economic security has been attained. Nor does identity as a positive goal or positive good seem to be a great moment in these periods of early struggle, when the question is whether one can learn English fast enough and effectively enough to improve one's job, or to maintain one's business, or to get a government job, or to relate to one's neighbors and to political authorities. It does not seem to be of the greatest importance to maintain the immigrant language, even leaving aside the question of whether the group has sufficient resources to do anything about it. The fact is, as Philip Gleason asserts in his article on American Identity and Americanization, the Harvard Encyclopedia of American Ethnic Groups, a volume to which all of us in Ararat on ethnicity recur when we have to deal with a new topic. He tells us the term identity was hardly used at all until the 1950s. I didn't check him out, but I suspect he's right. He goes on to point out that Erik Erikson, I quote from him, remarked on its novelty in his widely read book, Childhood and Society, 1950. Erikson wrote, "We begin to conceptualize matters of identity at the very moment in history when they become a problem. Otherwise, we would think about it. For we do so in a country which attempts to make a super identity out of all the identities imported by its constituent immigrants." Gleason refers to a later autobiographical account by Erikson in which he writes that the terms identity and identity crisis seem to grow out of, quote, the experience of emigration, immigration, and Americanization. So then, a new immigrant group doesn't worry much about identity. It has too many troubles, and part of its troubles is indeed its identity, the fact that it speaks a foreign language with a foreign accent is too identifiable. The first stages of assimilation and acculturation involve a crude and naive Americanization, inevitably. This Americanization, I would point out, as again recent announces of public policy comes from both sides. The immigrants are as eager to Americanize as the Americans are to Americanize them. And regardless of whether this Americanization is being imposed by the majority, or whether the schools are engaged in stamping out identity, the fact is that individual and group interest lies that way. Getting ahead means being less Jewish, less Irish, less Armenian. There was a deep insight in the famous and disputed thesis of Marcus Hansen about a third generation return. The issue is not which generation specifically finds it possible to become more interested in the ethnic past, language, culture, and religion. Perhaps it's the second, perhaps it's the fourth, and perhaps even the first, after a certain stage of assimilation success. The issue is rather that there is a succession of stages. First, adaptation and assimilation and acculturation, and a later stage in which one draws back, or some people draw back, ask what has been lost, and find the original past of the immigrant group attractive, perhaps more attractive than those who lived in it. It is that stage that immigrant groups who completed a major part of their immigration before the imposition of strict quotas in the 1920s are now living through. And I include the Armenians among them. Having read Mr. Mirak's article in the Honorary Encyclopedia of American Ethnic Groups, I'm aware there have been, and we've been told, there's a lot of Armenian immigration in recent decades, since after World War II, but still the major part of the Armenian community in this country, I assume, is from the immigration that ended in the 1920s. That is true of most European groups. I will, by the way, whenever there are cases on this, assimilate the Armenians to the Europeans for purposes of this point. So, there is certain market. So I'm saying that it is that stage of finding the ethnic past attractive that immigrant groups who completed the major part of their immigration before the imposition of strict quotas in the 20s now living through. They have now had 60 years since the end of this mass immigration. The third generation in these groups is becoming the majority. And we do see a phenomenon of increasing interest in ethnic identity. But in order to understand what is happening, we have to add to the generational pattern, speaking broadly, two other things. The specific history of each group, its problems and interests, which affect deeply the degree to which it wants to involve itself in ethnic issues, and the deep historical change that has taken place in the United States in the last 20 years in relation to ethnic. We deal, after all, with no automatic sociological pattern. We have to take into account history and the fact that no group in its experience is like any other group. I have argued that troubles maintain ethnic commitment, ethnic identity. Persecution means one is part of one's group and can't do otherwise. But when persecution discrimination declines, one in effect has a choice as to what degree of closeness and commitment to the group one maintains. Almost all European groups have such a substantial and wide degree of choice. I include Armenians. The groups, however, that do the best job of maintaining their institutions, culture, and influence, I think, are those that have troubles overseas which demand their involvement because their king is in trouble. I think one example of this, and I obviously will not go into the Armenian case, which I know only distantly, and all of you know better, is the Jewish case, which has certain parallels. And the fact is that Jewish leaders and writers, at least those most committed to Jewish group, worry about matters when things get too good for Jews, because they see crises overseas, and they worry about assimilation and distance from Jewish concerns if things get too good for Jews. There is a historical myth, I don't think the historical facts support it, that I often run into at some time, that the Jews of Alexandria in the first centuries of this era, last centuries and last, assimilated and disappeared because they were not sufficiently persecuted, not considered sufficiently different. This is presented by some Jewish leaders as threat. My own brief and unprofessional look at the historical record supports the first part of the myth. The Jews of Egypt did disappear or decline radically in numbers. But this was not because things were not because there was not enough anti-Jewish prejudice and persecution. But that is a recurring issue in American Jewish history. Similarly, Jewish historians and sociologists once argued that Jews of Central Europe were on the route to disappearance because of the high rates of intermarriage and conversion in Germany, Austria, and Hungary. Arthur Rupin, a leading Jewish sociologist and Zionist, so argued in a number of books. It did turn out that Jews were on the way to disappear in Central Europe, but not because of peaceful assimilation. Now the alarm is raised strongly in the American Jewish community. The intermarriage rates are high, even if conversion to Christianity is not common. The conditions that cause Jews to cluster together or to cling together, fear, persecution, prejudice, have in large measure disappeared. And if the conditions have disappeared, must we not expect Jewish identity to become weaker and weaker, the institutions of the Jewish community to find less and less support, the number of Jews to decline, along with the strength of their identity and commitment? My feeling is we must. There are costs to freedom from the point of view of those committed to the maintenance of difference. For a while, foreign troubles can substitute for native troubles. So even if Jews aren't being persecuted in the United States, they have a serious and urgent problem abroad. Jewish communities in various parts of the world, the Arab world, until most of the Jews left for Israel, Iran, Argentina, have been or are being threatened. There is no question that when one's kinsfolk are threatened overseas, and many of them are, in the most literal sense, kin, brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers, cousins more likely, distant cousins, and even if not they're considered such, one's kin is threatened, one has a powerful basis for demanding commitment to the group and its institutions, and one will find a response to such a demand. Indeed, in the Jewish community today, many voices are raised asking, with concern, is the only basis of Jewish communal life the defense of Israel? Important as that is, does it not suggest there are no deeper and more transcendent values in Jewish culture and religion if the agenda of every synagogue, every temple, and every community center is given by the needs of Israel? In this sense, foreign troubles may raise concerns about why is this group being kept together. I raise the Jewish case in considering how a specific history affects the degree and kind of identity found in the group for two reasons. One is because I know the Jewish situation best, but a second reason is that I suspect other groups, and perhaps the Armenian is a chief example, also maintain a good part of their communal life on the basis of needs, crises, demands, which do not find their origin in the United States, but abroad. We find a growing strength in the Armenian community, I believe, in the demands of the genocide of World War I, be in some way acknowledged, and that some partial reparation be made for something which can never be made good. In the Jewish case, there is a living state to defend. The remnant of historic Armenia, that is Soviet Armenia, is not threatened in the same way, cannot possibly be the basis for the kind of organization that Israel needs evoked in the Jewish community. But the living memory of the terrible crime committed against the Armenian people serves perhaps the same purpose. Ethnic identities, I would argue, are increasingly dependent in their sharpest form on troubles abroad. The Irish would not think much about their Irishness, anyway, think less about it, and most, I guess, don't think about it much even so, were it not for the troubles in Northern Ireland. Poles would be less Polish were it not for the domination over Poland wielded by Russia. And if Italians have less and less to worry about, if there is no longer an Italia evidenta, no threat to Italy and Italians, by that token alone, American Italians become less attacked. Some of us can still count on troubles abroad if our objective is the maintenance of ethnic identity. Jews can, Armenians can. I would comment in terms of the telegram from Governor Dukakis that a great deal of Greek action is based on Cyprus. But make no mistake, This support of identity by troubles from abroad fights against the powerful assimilating influences of American civilization. We live, I would argue, in the most open society in the world. Its openness is a continual threat to the maintenance of partial and separate identities. Once again, let me refer to the Jewish case. Intermarriage in the Jewish community is at a phenomenal level. I would assume, I know situations in other cases, the Japanese and so on, that intermarriage in the Armenian community is also at a very high level. It is, there is no question intermarriage reduces ethnic commitment. It must. There is no question it reduces it even more in the children of the intermarriage, who may not even consider themselves Jewish or Armenian, or whatever the minority partner of intermarriage is. Intermarriage raises also a special problem for the Jewish religion I'll go into. Sociologists are often asked to comment on intermarriage, generally by Jewish community leaders who are worried about it, less often by students contemplating intermarriage. There is only one simple thing to say, and I must say, I say it. If your children were still going to City College in Hunter, there would be less intermarriage. There was less intermarriage when Jews lived in dense Jewish communities and attended colleges that were 80 or 90% Jewish, and there is today, when Jews live in suburbs, which hardly ever have a majority of Jews, and go to colleges like Harvard, which are at best 1/4 Jewish. And so I conclude my talk with a simple reality. Choose City College or Harvard. If it is to be Harvard, you will have to live with the consequences. We are an open society and one which builds its own super identity, to quote Erickson, and it is a super identity that has many, many attractions. The Armenian case must be similar but even harder, for the simple reasons there are many fewer Armenians than Jews. How many fewer I have found it difficult to determine. The New York Times, quoting religious leaders, says 600,000. The Harvard Encyclopedia of American Ethnic Groups, Mr. Mirak, says 350 to 400,000. The ethnic identity says it's 250,000. I'll count one 400,000. But whatever it is, there are many, many fewer than Jews. As a result, it is harder to create concentrations of Armenians. And if one cannot, when there are those consequences of social meeting and marriage, change, education for one's children, that means that the chance of maintaining a strong identity is weakened. The Armenians, after all, after only 1/10 the number of American Jews, who themselves are only a small minority, 2 to 3% of the American population. Those ethnic advocates and leaders who saw America undermining commitment and identity were right. It does. It was the inevitable consequence of the opportunity that America offered, and there were few who wished to limit the opportunities they pursued to their own ethnic enclave. But now there is another factor affecting ethnic identity, and that is that the United States, which once tried, not with great effect I believe, to make everybody into a common American and then gave up the ethic, is now pressed to assist ethnic leaders in keeping everyone more ethnic. Just as we have moved in connection with discrimination in employment and education, first to non-discrimination and then to affirmative action, we have in a mild way moved first away from strong Americanization efforts in culture and language, then to a kind of mild affirmative action. The reflection of that mild affirmative action is seen in the public support of efforts to create curriculum and teaching materials for specific ethnic groups, very modest support, I might say, and the public support, a little more expensive, for bilingual education, which is really a kind of education which tries to take account of and in a way maintain language and culture. Some of us who were raised under the program of strong Americanization and feel we didn't suffer because of it have been skeptical about these developments. Again, every group is different, and the meaning of such programs is not the same for every group. I will not speak about blacks and Hispanic Americans. I think their situation is very different from that of the European and Near Eastern groups, whose major period of immigration came to in the 1920s. I'm speaking now about these groups, which have been able to get a little public support on the following black and Hispanic development efforts, heritage programs, and foreign language programs. Does that change the equation? Does this mean that America has moved from a society which, in its fierce commitment to Americanization and its openness undermines identity, to one which is now committed to maintaining it? I don't think it has moved that way. I don't think itself has moved that. Our modest efforts in support of language and culture in the schools are just that, very modest indeed. They exist in part because identity and commitment among ethnic groups is now so weak that no one envisions it as a threat to an overarching American identity. The fact that we now look, all of us, old Americans and new, in a more kindly way on efforts to maintain ethnic identity and attachment reflects our knowledge that in the end, Americanization works. We worried in World War I about the loyalty of the Germans, and we were wrong. We worried in World War II about the loyalty of the Japanese, and we were wrong. A lot of us worry today about the future loyalty and identity of Americans and Mexican Americans, and I suspect that this is still not settled. We will find that the powerful assimilating efforts of American society are still at work, even if we no longer find children, as we don't in the schools, if they speak Spanish, and indeed even if we give them the right to do so. I think it is all for the best. The United States is a unique society that permits a great deal of attachment to heritage and background, while expecting at the same time that everyone becomes an American. The strange term which is without specific ethnic reference. Because of our experience with previous ethnic groups, and because, one must say, we are not as chauvinistic or, if you will, patriotic as we were, we are far more tolerant of efforts to maintain ethnic identity than we were in the past. The question this poses for ethnic advocates is, how far shall they push that tolerance? How much do they want to maintain? How much do they want to push for public support? With what consequences do they push for? I must say, while these are important questions for various ethnic groups, I think in the end the conclusion will be the same, except in those special cases where an international crisis affecting a whole land mobilizing sons and daughters in this country. The conclusion is the steady weakening of the ethnic identity, ending with a kind of symbolic attachment rather than any full presence of a different culture and language. Cultural pluralism, a nation of nations, phrases that go back to the 20s and the 40s, envisioned a development that simply hasn't come to pass as far as the European immigrants are concerned. It may be different to Hispanic Americans. We have become one nation, as much one nation as any of the old nations of Europe. So that what is left for those of us still attached to our pasts and our differences? I must say, coming to this paragraph, it was the most difficult. What is left, I suspect, is the kind of thing that is being done at this conference and of many others and many publications. The respectful study of our past, the maintenance of the knowledge of that past, an ever-deepening understanding of the complex story of how people from 100 different countries all ended up as Americans, more like each other than each of them was like the people they left behind in their homeland. I think what is also left is a tolerance for those who want to maintain a further identification beyond the symbolic with the past than I think most Americans do. We are now far past the time when we believed we had to impose, and you see the we is so ambiguous, and now that we means like Americans in general, when we believed we had to impose Americanization on everyone. we now know it comes naturally. Remember France. I think that speaks well for America. But even as we change, it is incumbent on us to remember where we came from and to consider what obligations that places upon us, both for memory and for some of us for action. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Glazer, for a very thoughtful and thought-provoking set of comments. I'm sure they'll give all of us a good deal about this thing. We now hear a discussion on the same problem, identity and assimilation, from the Armenian perspective. And for that, we call on Professor Hrair, Dekmejian of the State University of New York in Binghamton, professor of political science who has dealt extensively with problems of leadership in the Middle East and whose forthcoming work on Islamic fundamentalism touches a subject of deep importance. Professor Dekmejian will speak to us on the Armenian perspective.
Coming here to speak takes me back many years. I won't tell you how many years. When I was a student across the river. And one day a friend said, let's go attend a meeting at Harvard. A meeting of NAASR. I said, NAASR is in Egypt. At the time I was studying NAASR of Egypt, but he told me that there was an association almost by that name, and I was brought into a very large and cavernous Harvard church-like structure, which I wouldn't be able to find. I barely got here after getting lost for an hour. And there was Manoog, of course, and many of the faces that I see here, and Sir Handlin Gibbs, the famous Harvard Middle specialist whom I admire. And therefore coming here reminds me of all that, and I'm pleased to see that the organization Manoog has got grown old, well, not quite, but has grown as old as it has. It's a pleasure for me to speak in the presence of two very senior and distinguished colleagues, as well as my spiritual mentor, one of my very admirable spiritual mentors, Archbishop Deranian, as a very humble deacon of the Armenian Church. I've always admired him and loved him. Professor Glazer and I, we did not get together yesterday or ever. This is the first time I saw him, although I knew him through his very distinguished record of publication. And I'm going to use some of the same terms. This is not by planning or previous plotting. My task today is quite complex. I'll try to do it in about 35 minutes. The terminology, however, that I was going to use included a couple of more recent words, although not too recent, including identity and identity crisis. I was told by NAASR to keep the jargon to a minimum, and therefore I'll try to do that. And I think that's good advice. Those of you who ask for empirical evidence, please remember that I have not tested empirically most of these hypotheses. Some others should do that, or I'll probably do it sometime when I have time. Most of my views are sort of impressionistic, based on the Armenian experience, and always, of course, in comparison with the other ethnic experience that I have to live every day, because I mostly teach at SUNY Binghamton Jewish students. About 90% or 80% of my classes are on political leadership, ethnicity or the Arab-Israeli conflict or Middle East politics consist of Jews. So I have a lot of evidence, sort of experiential evidence on Jews, and my evidence on Armenians are how I feel and what I've read and what I've seen. But none of this is empirically sound, so it's untested, so you have to forgive me for that. Determinants of Armenian survival in America. During the last 4 decades, Armenian life in America has been affected by various social and political forces, which have exercised a diffuse and often contradictory influence on the community. And Professor Glazer pointed out about one of those contradictory influences that I will discuss a little later. At the risk of oversimplification, I propose to analyze Armenian life in the American dispersion under 6 conceptual rubrics. The first is the international environment. Armenians, as the minorities Professor Glazer mentioned, perhaps even more than any other minority except the Jews, have been powerfully influenced in this country by the international environment, specifically what happens in their homeland and what happened in their homeland, as well as to other Armenian ethnic communities in other countries. So this powerful influence has exercised an impact, and just to give you an overview, let's go back to the approximately 100 years, and let me just list all of the events most of the events at least, that I think have affected the American community, the American Armenian community. The massacres of 1894, 95 in Turkey, the famous Hamidian massacres, and then the Young Turk Revolution of 1908. That made everybody happy and made everybody hopeful that there'd be liberty and security in Turkey, which was not the case. And the next year we had the Adana massacres of 1909, and the Adana massacres, of course, reminded us that indeed things in Turkey were not as the revolution of 1908 promised them that they would be. After each of these, of course, there were masses, waves of immigration going out of Turkey and coming a significant portion into the United States. And of course, the powerful impact of the 1915 massacres and the massacres of 1919, 1922 brought additional people to this country. But no event, perhaps, was as influential next to the massacres of 1915 as the Russian Revolution of 1970. That revolution was to shape Armenian life more than perhaps any other event. And after Armenia became independent in 1918, as you know, after a 2.5-year existence, a period of desperate struggle. I've been reading the second volume of Richard Kulhanjian's The Republic of Armenia, and it gives you a depression. Please do read it, though. But after that 2.5-year existence, of course, the western part of Armenia was being invaded by Turkey, and the eastern part, a very small portion, was Sovietized in 1920. And this brings us to a very interesting sort of breaking point, juncture in the history of the Armenian-American community. Now, the American Armenians were in a sense isolated, as were most of the communities of the dispersion, because the Soviet Union now very soon became a Stalinist state, and of course relations were, the borders weren't open, and the ties between the communities, especially in during the Great Purges, were minimal. Now, of course, the Sovietization of Armenia left the Armenian-American community with a very, very nasty politicized situation where the conflicts began between the parties, and throughout that period, a lot of many sad pages were written, including the assassination of the Archbishop Kulhanjian. The Stalin's purges, meanwhile, affected the Armenian community in this country in the sense that after a while we could find out what was happening in the homeland. Many an intellectual was disappearing, and the cream of the Armenian intellectual class and the political class, the political elite of that period, simply disappeared. And then World War II and the Armenian sacrifices in that war on both fronts, in the West as well as in the East, but particularly in the East, where we tried to show how great we were as Soviet citizens, as citizens of the Soviet Union, and we had to be one of the first units to break into Berlin and to climb on the top of the Reichstag, and that cost thousands and thousands of sacrifices. But then the Armenians had not really understood the nature of Stalinist Russia, because as soon as the war stopped, miraculously the gates were thrown open, and there was that famous that phenomenon called Mirak, the return to the homeland. And thousands went, perhaps 300,000, and a very large, a significant number from the United States as well. Now, going back to the Soviet Union from the free world, if I may use that term, the free world, took a lot of nationalism. That meant Armenian nationalism. Such tremendous dedication. Armenians throughout the Middle East and the free world sold what they had and went home. And as soon as they went home, they discovered that the homeland, life in the homeland, was extremely painful. Not only there was no political freedom, but the economic situation was extremely bad, and a hard worker could not get ahead, as he did in the United States or other parts of the world. And therefore, that experience was a very traumatic one. But then the Armenians also had a momentary high soon after the Second World War, as the Soviet Union presented Turkey with its territorial demands. Some of them were in the name of the Armenian Republic. And of course, Turkey came to the American side, and the Cold War began, and those territorial demands were left demands. And soon, once Khrushchev came, he told Turkey that the Soviet Union has no territorial demands in the name of the Armenian people. But then there was the Cold War, and the Cold War among the Armenians was even hotter, even colder, than that among the great powers. We took the Cold War seriously. The ideological polarization was incredible. We fought with each other. We physically fought with each other in the Lebanese Civil War of 1958. In fact, Armenians killed each other in that war, something they haven't repeated, thank God. And that Cold War, of course, brought a lot of sadness and demoralization to the community. 1953, Soviet-Turkish rapprochement, and the Armenian question is once more buried, as it's been buried so many times. One has to have patience. If you've been around for 3,000 years, you've got to have patience. That's why I really fail to understand why some of the militant Armenians don't have more patience. That was a side comment. Then there was, in the Middle East, the destabilization of a number of large Armenian communities, partly as a consequence of Arab nationalism, or Arab nationalism, partly as a consequence of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And that situation, of course, again, increased the number of immigrants coming to the United States and to Canada. And then the situation in Armenia proper became more positive, more bearable as Khrushchev took over and we had the era of liberalization. Soon after Khrushchev's departure came the first major public outcry in the Armenian Republic. In 1965-66, the Armenians were the first and the last, it appears, community to go on a demonstration en masse, where a whole country stood up, a whole city stood up, hundreds and thousands of people stood up against the Soviet authorities to protest against Soviet Turkish rapprochement and to protest against the refusal of the Soviet government to permit the Armenians to observe April 24th, the commemoration of the genocide of 1915. Well, the first secretary was purged. He became, they sent him somewhere to be the assistant minister of electrical installations, and there were other purges, some imprisonment. But the Brezhnev regime was flexible enough to permit us to have our own Yad Vashem at the top of the hill, mountain outside Yerevan, and to go there once a year to sing, to pray, and to go good toward Turkey with a fist for Mount Ararat, which of course was that on the other side. There were closer relations between the dispersion, the diaspora communities, and the Armenian Republic. There was a period of détente. Cold War was gone for a while at least, and things psychologically for the Armenian community appeared tolerable. And that's when Cyprus came, and that's when came Lebanon, 1975, Cyprus 1974, and a new era of desperation began, and a new militancy began to develop. Our community in Lebanon, especially its poorer sectors, were radicalized. They learned how to fight. They had to learn how to fight to protect themselves. And partly out of that environment, partly out of the tremendous influence of Turkey and its militancy against the Armenians, came out the militancy of the Armenians throughout the dispersion and even in the Soviet Republic. And therefore, in the 70s, we had another very saddening experience, reverse repatriation, new waves of immigration into this country, this time from Soviet Armenia. 1979, the Iranian Revolution, another destabilizing element. I will now go to my, with this background, I will go now to specifically some features, some perceptions I've had of the American Armenian community, and discuss them under several topics. The first is cultural elitism versus the melting pot. As in the case of other ethnic groups, the Armenian immigrants of the late 1880s and the early 1900s suffered a major culture shock in the American setting. In contrast, the immigrants arriving after World War II were more prepared to confront the American culture and milieu by virtue of their higher levels of education and cosmopolitan orientation. In either case, however, the Armenian immigrants faced a unique problem in the West and the United States: how to accommodate his sense of elitism and exclusivism to the advanced, affluent, and assimilated culture of America. Indeed, Armenian survival in the homeland and in the Middle Eastern dispersion had always depended on a powerful sense of ethnic elitism and exclusivism, reinforced by adherence to nationalized Christianity and educational, cultural, and economic prowess in an underdeveloped Muslim environment. After their adherence to Christianity in 301, the Armenians had proclaimed themselves Nor Israel, the new Israel, as a vanguard of Christian civilization among the Muslims. It was this sense of superiority that was powerfully challenged and compromised in the American setting. The quest for Christian national exclusiveness could not be effectively sustained in the nebulous, secular, semi-Christian environment of America. And therefore, the Armenians were faced with my next rubric, the whole sort of range, from assimilation to acculturation to what I call symbiosis. Throughout its century-long existence in America, the Armenian community has evolved through various social, psychological phases of development. In the cultural sphere, its developmental modalities have ranged from assimilation to acculturation to symbiosis. While some portions of the community have become assimilated fully into the larger American culture, other segments have preferred to maintain a greater degree of ethnic identity through some degree of acculturation. The latter category has constituted a large segment of the community. Its members have successfully adapted themselves to American life ways. An equally large category of Armenians, mostly but not exclusively, consisting of post-World War II immigrants, lived in a state of cultural symbiosis, a more or less culturally autonomous coexistence with American society. Its members are tightly integrated in Armenian communal life in terms of participation in ethnic activities within churches, schools, and cultural associations. They tend to persist in their sense of ethnic nationalism and exclusivism, and maintain close cultural spiritual ties with the Armenian homeland and other diaspora communities. The assimilative dimension, therefore, is likely to affect, what is one factor that will affect the Armenian-American communal life in the next 2 decades. Another aspect is the cultural and generational cleavages within the community. During recent decades, the cultural cleavages between the immigrants from different parts of the homeland and the dispersion have been replaced by cleavages between native Armenian Americans and the newcomers. This type of communal conflict has been discernible particularly in church life. This conflict is reinforced not only by cultural and linguistic differences, but by the efforts of the newcomers to acquire economic mobility in a shorter period of time than it took the earlier immigrants. Also, there is a perpetual generational conflict between parents who seek to perpetuate the ethnic culture and their children who are more prone to acculturate into American life. However, there has been some reversal in this pattern during the last decade, characterized by a new outburst of ethnic pride among some of the younger generation. The other factor that has affected the Armenian community, and it's likely to affect it more powerfully during the next 2 decades, is this very true term that if I may use, embourgeoisement, that Professor Glazer referred to in a simpler context, using a simpler term, their tendency to gain upward mobility. Since their arrival, the Armenians have joined the mass American quest for upward socio-economic mobility. They have succeeded in this quest en masse, more than most ethnic groups in America. This achievement of socio-economic success has reinforced the inbred conservatism of the Armenians and has been responsible for increasing support for the Republican Party, among other things. Thus, that's until what Mr. Reagan did recently, the State Department not recognizing, calling the massacres the alleged massacres, and what Mr. Reagan pulled a couple of weeks ago in the House and in the Senate. I wonder if the Armenian people are going to vote their pocketbooks, or are they going to vote they'll self-respect. Thus the upper, that was a personal. Thus the upper and upper middle class sectors of the community display a strong commitment to maintain their status of material well-being, as has been the case with other ethnic groups. These classes tend to oppose militant and explicit manifestations of ethnic nationalism. And finally, I'd like to talk about the end of ideology phenomenon, or the end of ideology syndrome, that David Bell talked about some 15 years ago. In general terms, the Armenians are no exception to the national trend in the decline of ideology in the United States and in the Western democracies. While they remain strongly nationalistic in their identification with the United States and its ideals, Armenians tend to be somewhat dovish and reluctant in supporting confrontationist American foreign policy. Nor are they supportive of leftist or rightist radical movements. The left radicalism of the 60s and the right radicalism and religious fundamentalism of the 80s enjoy virtually no support among Armenians. The combination of hard-nosed common sense, business pragmatism, and preoccupation with security has militated against extremist causes. During the 1960s, this end of ideology trend also became manifest in Armenian cultural affairs. After 40 years of protracted and intense conflict between the Armenian political parties, there was a notable atrophy of ideological commitment along Tashnagist versus anti-Tashnagist lines, which had split the church, the family, and cultural and educational institutions. This end of ideology current coincided with the decline of the Cold War and the progressive socio-economic ascendance of the community. In this period, there was a significant weakening of Armenian political parties and their rise in the attempts to maintain intra-communal peace. But after all this, my last topic, and I think, well, almost last topic, I have two more pages, alienation and identity crisis. Why alienation after all this, and why identity crisis? Behind the veneer of economic and social well-being lurks the tortured soul of the Armenian American. Whatever the degree of success in the socio-economic sphere, the Armenian psyche continues to bear the scars of suffering and genocide, compounded by a deep sense of injustice and outrage against Turkey and its supporters in the world community. It is this sense of feeling, this feeling of subdued rage and political impotence which has created the Armenian dual personality. The confident, extroverted, and good-natured member of Western society, bent on conformity and success, on the one hand, and the perpetual rebel and the persistent alienate, scarred by the burden of his tragic past, who views the world with deep cynicism, despair, and metaphysical anguish. This psycho-spiritual dichotomy finally surfaced during the 1970s in an upsurge of militancy in every community, from the Armenian Republic to the United States. Its immediate catalysts included displacement and deprivation suffered by the large Armenian communities of Lebanon, Iran, and Turkey. The emigration out of Armenia itself added to the widespread demoralization. The Lebanese civil war exposed the country's affluent Armenians to the radicalizing influences of their revolutionary milieu. Hence the beginning of armed militancy against the Turkish government, which has persisted in denying its genocidal role, and has instituted a massive campaign to distort history and to denigrate the Armenian people in its worldwide propaganda. And therefore, my last topic deals with precisely ethnic resurgence and mobilization, the notion of a mobilized diaspora. A combination of factors were responsible for the resurgence of Armenian ethnic nationalism in the United States during the 1970s. These were triggered by several developments. The pervasive revival of ethnic sentiment among other ethnic groups in America. 2, the progressive destabilization of the large Armenian communities of the Middle East, as I mentioned. 3, the deep realization that the Armenians of the Soviet Union and the Republic itself were politically helpless in protecting the threatened communities of the Middle East and in pursuing the Armenian cause in international council. 4, the progressive conviction that only armed violence could bring attention to the Armenian plight, despite a general feeling of opposition in the community to the use of violent tactics. 5, a tendency to participate and as a compact interest group in the American political process. After centuries of political inactivity in just about every country they went to, and political lethargy, an effort which has begun to produce some results. 6, the conviction that only through a reassertion of ethnic identity and unified action will the Armenians be able to counter the demoralizing impact of Turkish propaganda efforts against them. Finally, in conclusion, in terms of considering future scenarios of ethnic survival, I was asked to list some, and I've always wanted to become a prophet, but I never had the calling. But I'll try it as a social scientist. I have 4 determinants that I've listed, and I assure you that they're incomplete. And most of them probably will prove untrue. But I'll read them anyway. 1, as the determinants of Armenian ethnic life in America in the next 2 decades are likely to include 1, economic conditions in the United States and the Armenians' relative position within that context. 2, the ability of the community to mobilize itself politically and culturally to play a role in American politics and at the international level. 3, the relative influence of other politically ascendant ethnic groups, particularly Jews, blacks, and Hispanics. 4, the evolution of Soviet American, Turkish American, and Soviet Turkish relations. Thank you very much.
Thought-provoking and stimulating lecture. I'm sure will give the participants of the conference a great deal about things. Both of our lecturers have also, I have no doubt, raised a variety of questions you may wish to explore further. But before we open the floor to questions, there are some announcements that I think should be made.
Just to bring to your attention that due to some construction work, the parking lot, the open parking lot next to this facility will not be available to us during the day, Friday and Saturday. So we have arranged for the 2 parking garages near the Harvard campus to be available. If you receive information in the mailing, you'll be aware, but let me quickly mention where they are. One is the Broadway garage that runs between Cambridge and Broadway Street on Felton Street. You should enter it on the Cambridge Street side. This is 2 blocks east from the tunnel that goes under the area near Harvard Yard behind the fire station. The other one would be the Everett Street garage, corner of Everett Street and Massachusetts Avenue, 1 block towards Harvard Square from the Holiday Inn area for some of you who are staying there. I do have with me special slips that you should be able to obtain from me at the conclusion of this meeting, and you should display those on the dashboard visible on the windshield of the car. When you park, please park the 3rd level and above in both parking garages. I will hand out the slips as you depart. Manoog has asked me to make a couple of other announcements. I'd like to remind you to all sign the sheets that were outside. If you list the sheets as you came in, have your name and address and information with you come to the sessions Friday and Saturday. They're very interesting sessions. The Friday session will start at 9:30. Registration will be conducted at 9 o'clock. In this same building, except the hall is the brown room. Exactly opposite to this is coming to the lawn, what we like about this room. I would also like to bring to your attention that NAASR has a select number of books dealing with the Armenian American community and related topics available for sale in the room next door as you go out. Like the first door on the right. They're there for you and hopefully you. Any further announcements can be made tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. Cambridge is always important as a matter of survival in the park. Well, now you've had 2 very stimulating thoughts, somewhat parallel, but not altogether in accord one with another. And I have no doubt that there are a good many questions that you may wish to raise now. speakers are captive for a while. Are there any questions? Yes.
I'm very interested to know if Professor Dekmejian can say something about cultural ethnicity in Soviet Armenia. Are the Soviet Armenians, the new generations, now becoming more assimilated to the general, becoming Sovietized?
The question is whether Soviet Armenians in Soviet Armenia are becoming Sovietized, or whether they're able to persist in their ethnic identity there.
That's a very large question. One could differentiate between Soviet Armenians in Soviet Armenia, Soviet Armenians, 1.5 million of them, in other republics of the Soviet Union. The rate of assimilation is much faster in the other republics of the Soviet Union because Armenians are not encouraged to have ethnic associations and churches and so on. In fact, a number of Armenian churches which were closed during the revolution in places like Moscow and elsewhere, Crimea and so on, have not been reopened under the Soviet authorities until today. So there are many. In fact, if I were to guess, the fastest rate of assimilation of the Armenians is occurring outside the Soviet Armenian Republic in other parts of the Soviet Union, especially in large Siberian centers, in the scientific communities, in the Ukraine and in Russia itself. In the Armenian Republic, of course, yes, there is some assimilation, but the Armenian Republic is most heavily native of all the republics. Over 88–90% of the population are Armenians. And while you're very much encouraged to learn Russian, and there are special Russian schools for you to get ahead, you need that kind of thing. Everybody speaks Armenian. There are also large Armenian communities in Azerbaijan and Georgia. And those communities, well, there's some assimilation there, but not very fast. For example, this fellow Gary Kasparian, he's an Azerbaijani Armenian, the chess player. So we have Armenian nationalists, or those of us who are, who insist on perpetuating the Armenian identity, do not have to worry about it in Armenia itself. Although many are not pleased with it because the Armenians in Armenia are not as religious as we would want them. If you read, for example, a cleric or one who feels that Armenian identity should have a spiritual sort of religious component, because many don't. But again, you see a lot of young people in the churches, and a lot of party members who come and secretly at night they have baptism.
Yes.
I have a question for Professor Dekmejian. When you mentioned ideology and a decline in ideology among Armenians, either right or left, I'm curious to know within this country whether that has whether that's been affected in any way by the Armenian Church and the association of a newer generation and its interest in the Armenian Church.
Well, of course, religion is, especially the Armenian variant of religion, is another kind of ideology, believe me. Social scientists have looked upon religion, or at least some, as an ideology. The power of Islamic fundamentalism as a political ideology is incredible. I mean, the Iraq-Iran war, of course, is the greatest example of that, the most explicit example of it. It's a religious war, and it's as political as you can get. So the Armenian Church, therefore, gives you a certain kind of an ideology, but then it depends on politically speaking, the level of ideology there is a reinforcement of the Armenian identity to remain an Armenian. Okay, because in the Armenian Christian, in the Armenian Church, you're told that yes, the best way to keep the Armenian identity is by being an Armenian Christian or Christian Armenian. There may have a point in it, by the way, because of course, that should not be the Church's primary mission. The Church's primary mission should be purely religious and spiritual. But often the Armenian Church has played that function and played it quite well, I must say. But beyond that, what church you attend will determine your ideology. In fact, especially during the great Cold War years, if you attended the Pashtun churches, you had a Pashtun ideology. If you attended the other churches, not everybody, but roughly speaking, there were a core of militants on each side. But the church generally, as a spiritual institution, I suspect would have a declining influence on ideology, on political ideology, at least in the case of the Armenians.
Yes. I just have a clarification. You said it's important to be an Armenian Christian or a Christian Armenian. Are there any other kind of Armenian?
Sure. Well, that debate has been going on for a long time, and that debate, in fact, got a number of people in trouble back in the 50s. It used to be a very serious question. It's not as serious now. Many secular Armenians, old revolutionaries, communists, Pashtuns and Hunchaks and others, who went through all kinds of blood and so on and so forth. Well, they were enlightened, so they saw the Enlightenment and secularism. They were very, very secular. I remember a Pashtun friend, a very famous one, whose name I don't want to give, who was in a church here about 20 years ago on Elton Avenue, and my friend went, a deacon, and did the tour bar in front of him, since he was forcing him to cross himself, and he wouldn't. In fact, that my deacon friend challenged him to do so. So there's that very, very strong secular notion, very much, by the way, very similar to the Israeli case, where we had Ben-Gurion and many of the Mapai people were very strongly secular. Does anyone remember Ben-Gurion going to the synagogue? I don't. And you have very, very, very similar dimensions here. On the other hand, I believe most Armenians associate Christianity as their type of Christianity. In a sense, the Armenian sect of Christianity. And the Armenians are happy to be a sect. I mean, they want to be a sect almost, because they like that exclusivism. Beyond a certain point, Armenians talk about ecumenism and so on and so forth. Believe me, deep down, they are very happy to be different. I mean, until today, they use classical Armenian in the church liturgy. Can you imagine that? Classical Armenian, how many of us know it? President Thompson?
But aren't there more than one sect, Christian sect in the Armenian group?
Yes.
Does that divide them or do anything in terms of their unity or mobilization?
Yes, it does. I believe that in the past it has. Although, as the Jews found out, the Ottoman authorities did not differentiate once it came to the massacres. They didn't ask who was a Protestant Armenian and who was a Catholic Armenian and who was Orthodox. They just cut everybody. Generally, some people think that the more a person is Orthodox, the more nationalistic he is, although recently I've seen a number of Protestants who are extremely nationalistic, or ethnic, so to speak. But unity in the past has been affected, but now, probably not. But I'm guessing.
Yes.
I want to ask Professor Glazer a question.
you said that it looks as if ethnicity is moving towards a kind of symbolic. That's going to be the function of being Armenians, of being Jews, and that's me. There seems to be something a little bit more in the Armenian community. Let me give you some examples. We have community centers growing up throughout the country, and these are extremely expensive centers. And they always are able to raise the money, and it's to keep the children there and the community. And they're very active. Sometimes you get two in the same community. It seems to be a little bit more than somehow symbolic. We have all sorts of intellectual groups cropping up at museums and libraries here in Boston. Part of it is sort of to preserve this and to show the Turks and everybody else who we are, but there seems to be something more. I'm not sure what it is. One of the problems we had with scheduling this meeting tonight was that there's a meeting of Armenians in one of the suburbs to honor an Armenian American politician who's supposed to be going to speak to the House. And partly I think we're doing this because we want him to get into power so he can help us in our fight with the Turks, which has to do with the overseas factor. But there's something more to it, I think, than that. And somehow it seems that in many cases, Armenians, when they grow up, tend to associate with Armenians. And then there's a cluster of things that I'm not sure what it's all about, but it seems to go beyond what I thought you meant by the symbolic. And I'm going to say something.
Well, I suppose the word symbolic doesn't really tell us anything, for one thing. I'm thinking of studies of, let's say, the Jewish community, but I think of studies of other communities. I'm very impressed at how high intermarriage rates are in all these communities. I've seen figures for the Japanese community. Oddly enough, I've seen figures recently for the most recent large American ethnic group, the Hispanic Americans. And it strikes me that this is a very important index of continuity. Now, since we're just going through this phase of very high immigration, if you look at these communities, it was rather different 20 or 30 years ago, it's possible that I'm reading more into it as one important index than I should. It's also possible, I know there's always a temptation to sort of speed up history and move faster than it gets speeded up. I mean, one might well say in a very long time period I will be proved right, may not be very interested in a very long time period. There are these, in the past I have been one of those who has emphasized the staying power of ethnicity, and I do think there's a lot of staying power, but I also think it needs outside support. I did suggest that the Armenians have a lot of this outside support. In the sense of the entire the genocide and the Roman slaves and the various shocks, international shocks that we were told about, and which keep on continuing, and that keeps things going. And one might say, well, history is the kind of thing where this kind of thing never stops. Well, for some groups it finally stops. It's hard for me to think of what will agitate the Italians for a long time to come. And it is in that perspective that I feel that there is a continual pressure on the maintenance of identity in its fuller form. Certainly it's unlikely the language continues. That's not the key, it's not necessarily the key factor. One thing that does continue almost always is the religious identification, that changes its character. So it's, we're really talking about overall tendencies, and my sense is the overall tendencies to assimilation in this country are very strong. But I've also not defined what symbolic means. And that was not too absent of time. We may call it symbolic ethnicity. It may have a great deal of meaning, a great deal of impact in affecting behavior. It may well be the case that the loss of language and of commitment to the maintenance of community to marriage within it, and even the weakening of educational institutions. I don't know just how many Armenians get a distinctive Armenian education part-time, let's say. It may be that even with all these declining, there still is a great deal left. So we don't deal with anything that can be definitively determined.
I'm sort of thinking out loud. Seems to me that while the Italians, we don't know what will educate them, you know, they've gone through this, and so many of the others, aside from groups like the Armenians, that we're getting the international shocks that keep this ethnicity of the fuel, the fires that it fuels. Might there not be the copycat factor in this? The smaller groups who did not before even think of or are not even maybe large enough to deal with their ethnic factors, might not they be coming to the fore now to say, well, everybody else has had their day, I'll have mine?
No, that is certainly one element. I think that
some minor
it plays a role. And it's not only the copycat factor. Once you already have public programs, there's always someone ready to join in. If they join in, that may give an additional push. It would have been interesting to look at the ethnic heritage grants and see how many went to Armenians. I would be surprised if there were few because of the degree of active interest in the community. But I do think these, once again, don't stand against the very top, in the long run. Maybe the long run should not concern us because it would be too long to manage.
Yes. First, if I may comment on what Professor Dekmejian said a little while ago about Soviet Armenia and the assimilative process there. I would disagree with what he said, and that there's a greater danger of assimilation in Soviet Armenia today than anybody thinks. And this according to not only people recently immigrating from there, but also according to statistics. For instance, today in Yerevan, there are more students attending Russian schools than there are students attending Armenian schools, although there are fewer Russian schools, but they're larger. And the danger is greater there because of the complacency of the population, that nothing can happen there. And if the Russian schools that are seem to be more attractive just because there are ways to move upwards in government. You have to know Russian, you have to be proficient in Russian to get ahead. My question beyond that comment concerns the two words that form the topic of this conference. One is identity, the other is assimilation. Assimilation we might know something about if we knew what is being assimilated into what, and that's identity. I think maybe the other speakers will address this, but my question to both speakers is, we're dealing with identity. We're dealing with an entity, if we will, a concept rather, but we haven't really explained what that is. We're taking that for granted. If we are to take that for granted, well, so be it. But I think there's a fundamental issue here, and that's the question of identity, and ethnic identity in this case. What's ethnic identity?
Well, I must say that I have had to think about that in terms of theses, books, and so on over the years. And I think of identity as being more or less of something by some measure. Now, one can argue with any measure one wants, but And there's a huge, there's a big range. For example, something I've recently read uses, again, this is the Jews, but uses measures of as a religious activity. There could be measures of how your friends divide one way or another. How do you feel about certain Jewish issues and so on? And the one sets a standard which one answer means more identity than the other answer. For Armenians, it might be, do you know what April 24th is? Now, I'm just being very crude. Maybe every Armenian knows what it is. So I assume that, you might find that among younger generations fewer know. Or do you do anything about it? Etc. In other words, identity is made up of many, many elements. Elements of knowledge, elements of emotive connection, elements of behavior. Now, this may not get to the heart of it. In reference to the previous question, one may well say identity can consist purely of awareness of difference without content, which would be a very reduced identity. And we have examples of that in terms of certain, again, the Jewish case, certain groups that don't know they're Jewish, a group in Mallorca, but they preserve a few customs that suggest that they were once Jews. And I suppose that's beyond identity. Another approach to identities, I know is used in developing countries to ask people, what are you? and people tell you. But I think that for the American theme, these measures how much identity, rather than what is identity, is really the most important one.
I think that I guess we probably should have started discussing these terms before anything else. We just took these things, we just assumed, well, we shouldn't have made the assumption. But in the case of the Armenians, I was just trying to think as you asked the question, what is Armenian identity? What does it consist of? Well, at the basic level, I think it's in the realm of feeling. It's a primordial sentiment, if you would. If you accept that if you feel Armenian, then you're Armenian. Now, beyond that, language perhaps, but I know a lot of Armenians who do not know Armenian itself, but who very strongly feel an Armenian identity. Then religion certainly has a role. It depends on the person. In each case, I think the degree of these components, the mix differs. In the case of some, their Armenian identity is through some kind of a leftist nationalism, for example, an Armenian communist. In another case, it could be a pure and simple linguistic, very powerfully in a poetic sense. In the case of Shiraz, the famous poet who died only last month. In the case of a religiously oriented Armenian, Armenianness is being a member of a devoted believer in Armenian Christianity. And so on. And for a variety of them, it could be various combinations of these. At least that's how I perceive it.
Yes. Let's ask both the gentlemen there, how does genocide enter into identity? In other words, how does genocide enter into identity? How does the fact that one particular people murdering your people make you feel a certain way?
Well, I think it certainly enters in. I was saying that much in the way of ethnic identities the United States is sustained, strengthened by foreign threats, or not necessarily things that happen in the United States, because an ethnic group is a kind of kin. There is a sense of connection. Undoubtedly, I would leave it up to you. I would think that had this genocide not occurred, Armenians lived relatively placidly in Turkey, the amount of Armenian identity in this country would be much less. There'd be much less to do, much less to organize about, much less to argue about, much less to feel about. And I would say that the same thing is true of Jews. And just as I commented that a number of Jewish thinkers argue that worry about Israel takes up too much of the Jewish agenda, but after all, there was also religion, there was also transcendent values and so on. So there are Jews who argue that the Holocaust plays too much of a role. That may not be known particularly outside the Jewish community, but there are a number of Jewish thinkers, writers, critics who say, is the only thing we have in Jewish life the Holocaust, because the Holocaust has created a great, not only huge literature, but a lot of courses. And, there are colleges and so on, centers of study and so forth. And people say, if the only Jewish course being given is one on the Holocaust, they feel that something has gone wrong. The balance of Jewish life has been distorted. So I would say, to have gone beyond your question, yes, it plays a very strong role, and some people feel it plays a bigger role.
Yes.
Sure.
Absolutely. Recently, a couple of years ago, a conference in Tel Aviv about genocide and compared to genocide. I couldn't go to that conference because I had to be in Egypt for a previous commitment, but I did send a paper, and the paper dealt with the application of a theoretical model to the both cases, the Jewish and the Armenian experiences. And the evidence that I've gathered through my research is absolutely that, in fact, if you, in the case of the Jews, the Holocaust, more than any other experience, provided the spiritual and the political momentum to press for independence in Palestine. Now, because that really clinched it. In the case of the Armenians, the genocide, the theme of genocide really recurs. You can't escape from it. Your mother talks about it when she wants you to do something. Anyone who wants to guilt-killing upon you talks about genocide. But it's there. It's a part of the Armenian psyche, and you can't escape from it. It's a very depressing thing, by the way. But again, it's a catalyst. I totally accept Professor Glazer's hypothesis about this external catalyst versus communal vitality. It's very true in the Armenian case.
Yes.
What I wanted to say, one other aspect of identity is the feedback that one gets from other people. I mean, if you give a name that's not Anglo-Saxon, they will say, what kind of name is it? So they force you to confront your ethnicity. Even in the throes of great assimilation that we're trying to work on, they will say, oh, where are you from? Give it a name that is. So therefore, identity, I think, is also clarified or emphasized by the people who are interacting with it. You as part of an ethnic group, but it's not the nation.
Well, I quite agree. That may be the last stand of ethnicity. The fact that that everyone expects everyone in this country to be ethnic in some way. the names were suggested, and behavior, and as I think it was Will Herberg said, or somebody else, you asked, what are you in this country? The answer is not supposed to be, I'm an American. That's a political speech, that's not an answer.
But along with that, it's a great compliment that America gives to immigrants, that they expect them to be Americans. Whereas France, they say you can be there 25 years and you'll never be a Frenchman, but here in 5 years, you're legally an American.
Are there any other? Yes.
Can I ask both panelists what they might think about the impact of gender roles in assimilation, particularly with regard to the shift between Middle Eastern culture and American culture in the more recent immigration?
General, yes, particularly the impact of our recent immigration from the Middle East.
Well, do you want me to speak as an male chauvinist? I don't know if there has been much impact, although it's a very interesting question. I would say that I think in the case Jewish women changed since they left. In Israel,
The recent Jewish immigration does not, well, it's out of the Soviet Union, and I don't think that there is any great difference in terms of, I think the point of the question might have been, very good point, that our recent Armenian immigrants coming from areas in which the role of women is very different from what has become in the United States. I don't think that's been playing much of a role in the Jewish community, because recent immigrants come either from Israel or from Soviet Russia, and in neither cases they're particularly subservient position for women.
So happened that I was asked this question 2,000 miles away yesterday. And I will give you my answer. Now, the countries in which there have been female heads of state, India, Ceylon, Israel, England, those are countries in which there were no, even England had no strong feminist movement since 1919. Whereas in countries where there is a strong feminist movement, it turns out to be anti-female in its consequences. Better fact than that.
in the case of the Armenians, the Armenian women did not have the same position as Muslim women, as you may know in the Middle East. They never covered their faces. They were quite free, although not equal in our present sense. And that has changed very rapidly in the last 50 years. Armenian women could even aspire historically to the diaconate, very active in the church and so on. So they couldn't become priests, and they haven't gone that far. But they may. The women I knew in the Middle East, the Armenian women I knew, were not really as much different from Armenian women in this country. Now, I don't want to tell you anything else. But, my mother.
I think this has been a very stimulating discussion that will provide a basis for fruitful conference in the few days. I'll conclude by saying one word about the other side of the equation, which no one heard, that is assimilation. Long, interesting discussion of what identity means. We sort of elided the question of what assimilation means. And this is very important in the context of American institutions and the kind of society we have. This is a society that has very few national, ritual, occasions, even ideologies. So if someone says in an abstract sense, what do I assimilate to? You can mention certain kinds of costume or habits or behavior. And when you deal with the great occasions of life, like if you have to bury someone, or marry someone, or bring someone up as a young person, it's very hard to say there's an American way of doing so. That is the same for everyone all over the place. And so this is very important because, as Professor Glazer pointed out, this is a period of very high intermarriage, no matter which way you slice it, racially, ethnically, religiously, doesn't apply just to these groups, but to older, well-established groups. The nature of these contacts is that are contacts that encourage intermarriage. But the people who are intermarrying less and less satisfied with civil ceremony. 50 years ago, there's justice and peace, there's religion business. Now, somehow, it doesn't make much difference, I suppose, but somehow something more is needed. And that's a paradox, because you should say that people who are taking that step are moving away, but they're not. They want to move towards something at the same time. And the same case applies, given a lot of special circumstances, education, rearing children, establishing family life, and even a search for different kinds of rituals and ceremonies, which in a way might as well be ethical. And often that's what that symbolic factor applies. So we're living in the midst of a very significant transition. And it's interesting to examine all these aspects of them because they apply to it. I want to thank our speakers, I want to thank you, and thank the organizers for the meeting.
Gentlemen, I think we should begin our deliberations, this being the first full panel devoted to our conference topic on identity and assimilation. While before I get into that, let me just mention a few groundwork. My name is Bob Mirak, and I am in charge of this session and shall be presiding. We will have 2 papers read, and after the 2 papers we will have a short break. We will then reconvene. Can you hear me? Yes. We will then reconvene and to hear the second 2 papers. We will then open up the session to questions. With respect to questions, I hope you will ask all the questions you want and as pointedly as you wish. This is a free forum. If you also want to make a comment, I think that's also appropriate. But you can't make a speech. That's for us. Someday, if you want to make a speech, we'll have a panel, and you can make it then. So that would be the only restriction. And as for my distinguished colleagues here, I shall be off. They were told that they should be speaking for approximately 30 minutes. I will be sending them a note at about 25 minutes to give them some kind of indication. And if they go much beyond the 30 minutes, I may have to exercise my prerogative. Having said that, we are here not to hear me, but to hear our panelists, whose topic is not directly relevant to the opening session last night, for the concerns of identity and assimilation were not those of the immigrant generation, the settlement. It was that of their children who were to be concerned, but in some senses they, as the offspring, were to be concerned. But our purpose now is to set the scene for the major problems, and we're delighted to have four speakers who are so conversant and who are so abreast of their field and have done such excellent work. Our first speaker is Dr. Martin Deranian, and I can't repeat his CV, his curriculum vitae, because there's so many things to be said that I would be usurping his time. Let me just simply say that he was educated at Clark University and at the University of Pennsylvania in the School of Medicine. And what's impressive about him is that having performed so well in the field of medicine, he has found time to do so much and so well in the field of Armenian studies, having published widely in such journals as Ararat and the Harvard Dental Alumni Bulletin on the career of Dr. Kulhanjian, and it informs me that as recently as last week, his article on Calvin Coolidge in an Armenian rug was cited in the congressional record. So let it not be said that NAASR people are behind the times. We are right up with those publications. And let me now turn our forum over to Dr. Martin Deranian.
Thank you for your kind introduction, Bob. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today. The names of America, and much less that of Worcester, Massachusetts, were virtually unknown to Armenians in their native land at the beginning of the 19th century. Fired by the missionary zeal which characterized the Second Great Awakening, two young New England Protestant ministers, the Reverend Messrs. Eli Smith and Harrison Gary Otis Dwight, in 1830 were sent by the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions on a 2,000-mile journey into the interior of Turkey and Persia to conduct a survey. And encountering enormous difficulties and near death on their 15-month overland expedition, they became the first Americans to tread the soil of the Anatolian provinces of Armenia. And in their book, Researches in Armenia, published in 1833, they reported of the Armenians in the interior of America they had never heard under any name. Well, America did not remain unknown for long. Not after June 9, 1831. On that spring morning, the Reverend Mr. William Goodell, an American missionary who spoke Turkish, disembarked at Constantinople from the sailing ship that carried him from Malta. Appointed as the first American missionary to Constantinople, he organized the mission to the Armenians. Well, in Constantinople, Mr. Goodell was 6,000 miles from his birthplace in the Worcester County village of Templeton, Massachusetts. And little did he realize that 50 years later, there would begin a massive western migration of Armenians to the very county in America where he was born. By 1852, a Protestant mission had been established in Hrair, in the deep interior of Turkey. And here in 1859, the missionaries established Armenia College, which was later renamed at the insistence of the Turkish government Euphrates College, and was destined to exert an enormous influence in the area. By 1813, there were 275 American institutions, schools, orphanages, clinics, which dotted the landscape from the Caucasus Mountains to the Bosphorus, and from the Black Sea to the Syrian desert. And the widespread influence of Americans among the Armenians has been likened to a blitzkrieg, as indeed it was. But as early as 1842, the Reverend Dwight found it necessary to discourage young Armenians from migrating to America. But his efforts were fruitless, because even as early as then, the American fever had begun. Well, the first Armenian to arrive in Worcester, Massachusetts, is remembered only as Garo, or Garabed. He came because of missionary influence, because in 1867, the Reverend George C. Knapp, an American missionary in Turkey, returned to his home in Worcester, Massachusetts for a leave of absence, and he brought with him his Armenian servant, Garo. It is said that Mr. Knapp wanted a native Armenian to produce on the lecture platform in proof of the atrocities which the Turks were already contemplating at that time. But it was the Irish laundress in the Knapp home who convinced Garo that he could do considerably better financially in the factories in Worcester than the 75 cents a month which he was earning as a household servant. Well, he quit and found work in the mill and established a pattern that his countrymen were to follow for long thereafter. Regretfully, little is recorded about Garo because he didn't stay permanently in Worcester. But the first permanent settler was Hovannes Yazijian, but he Anglicized his name and he called himself John Reiter, and he arrived in 1877. But he was a graduate of Euphrates College and worked as a translator for a missionary, the Reverend Herbert Allen, who was later to serve as the first editor of the Armenian newspaper Gochnak. Although married and with a family, he arrived alone. And in 1881, after being established, he brought his wife Sarah and their children to Worcester. By then, the entire Armenian population was no more than 20 persons. And each Sunday, they would gather at the Yazijian home to conduct prayer meetings and joint religious services, regardless of denomination, apostolic or Protestant. And this early manifestation of the ecumenical spirit, which lasted 8 years, was significant, extremely significant, because out of these prayer meetings grew the first apostolic and Protestant Armenian churches in the entire Western Hemisphere. I was the first Armenian woman to settle there, Mrs. Yazijian recalled. All the Armenians were accustomed to gather nightly in our home for long discussions. There was no difficulty in finding jobs. An average man could earn up to $8 a week, she remembered. And she's remembered as the mother of the Armenian immigrants. And following this immigration swell, because by 1887, the Armenian community of Worcester had grown to 400. The early immigrants were virtually all men, some of them who had been married and had left their families behind, as had Hovannes Yazijian. But to a bachelor, a woman was a rare jewel. And they literally stood in line to pay court to her. Being largely unfamiliar with the language, they lived in fraternity-like quarters, isolated from the rest of the community, yet bound together by their loyalty to one another and to their common traditions. Most of them lived in a section called Laurel Hill. Now, one geographer at Clark University has suggested that they chose this site because it reminded them of the hillsides which they had left in their native crosshairs. The cost of a room was $5 a month, which 4 or more of them shared together. Now, the largest single employer of Armenians in Worcester was the Washburn and Moen Manufacturing Company, the wire mill. It was also the largest enterprise in the city. After all, this was the era of the opening of the West, and barbed wire was in demand for fencing off the ranges, and women's hoop skirts demanded wire supports, and they made piano wire, and also wire for telephones and electric lights. As a result, it became the largest wire mill in the entire world. But by early as 1889, there were 265 Armenians who worked primarily as wire drawers which was indeed about 1/3 of the entire Armenian population of Worcester. Philip Lewis Moen was president of the corporation until 1891, was active in missionary work, and was said to have encouraged Armenians to emigrate to Worcester. The missionary in Turkey perhaps was the link between the factory owners such as Mr. Moen and the Armenians who would endure any sacrifice to come to America. One visitor to Worcester, when he toured the wire mill in 1891, wrote, "Oh, the heat is unbearable. A worker can stand near his oven only a couple of minutes. The place is dense with acrid smoke. I left suffocating after a few minutes. I had had my belly full, and I bade the place forever farewell." And also in that year, a correspondent from Worcester wrote in the New York Journal, "For God's sake, tell them not to come here. Tell our people over there and elsewhere not to come here. Neither the streets are lined with gold, nor is there a haven here. Come here and be buried." He remembered. Well, of course, at first they had no intention of remaining permanently, but rather planned to work here for a few years and return to their homeland in Turkish Armenia to buy land. Here with a few dollars, an American suit, which they all loved, and a gold watch, they would be considered the wise, traveled elder statesmen in the small villages surrounding Hrair. Now this was the case with both my grandfathers, one apostolic, the other Protestant, who arrived in Worcester alone in the 1880s from the village of Husine in Hrair province and worked in the wire mill. Well, of course, the story is they returned to Hrair only to perish in 1915. But about 80% of the Armenians in Worcester came from Hrair province. Worcester seemed to attract the villager, and Worcester was called Little Hrair. To the factory workers, the Armenians represented an excellent source of labor. Industrious, reliable workers, their willingness to work for lower wages made them extremely unpopular with the other workers, and they were called scabs, or strike breakers. My father was beaten almost every day by the other workers because he was Armenian, recalled John Aroyan, the son of one of the early immigrants. When I bought him lunch from mother, he would give me a dime to see a Chaplin movie. He didn't want me to see him because he looked so bad from his work. Well, they all lived a frugal, drab life, but no matter how little they earned, money was always sent abroad to bring friends and relatives to Worcester. You know, they couldn't walk the streets of Worcester at night alone. They had no interest in the labor movement. They were called goddamn Armenians or Turks and thought to be non-Christian Muslims. And when they had children, they were mocked and had snowballs thrown at them as they came home from school. Sometimes it must have seemed to them that they had left one form of subjugation in Turkey for another in America. But they had been admonished by their elders back home never to waver, but to be as stalwart as Mount Ararat. The Dictionary of Worcester in 1893 reported there are about 700 Armenians in Worcester, and the number is increasing. As a rule, they are industrious and worthy, and many are skilled artisans. They have been subject to persecution and some brutal treatments in Worcester. And Dr. Samuel Woodard, a very compassionate physician, recalled the early Armenian immigrants when he said, "I well remember a professional visit to a home on the east side where 12 men occupied beds in one room, 6 at a time, one of them acting as cook and caretaker. And many of these poor fellows were patients in city hospital, for they had been stabbed with knives, beaten with sticks, burned with fire, and their neglected injuries demanded attention. And never shall I forget how a few years later a deputation went to the superintendent of the hospital, told him how grateful they were for what the city of Worcester had done for them, and handed him, for the hospital, a considerable sum of money." No matter how deplorable their living conditions, they never became public charges. They just were too proud and served as their own social agency. The immigrant, however illiterate or ignorant he may be, Henry Frick, the 19th century American steel tycoon, complained, always learns too soon. But by the end of the 19th century, Worcester had become known as the Armenian metropolis of the country. And like a magnet, Worcester drew Armenians to her. But to the immigrant, Worcester became synonymous with America. He wouldn't believe he was in the United States until he set foot in Worcester. Now, a likely dialogue between an Armenian immigrant at Ellis Island and an immigration official at the turn of the century has been suggested by John Aronian. The official would say to the Armenian, "What is your destination?" And the Armenian would say, "America." But the official would say, "But you're in America now." But the Armenian would say, "No, Worcester is America." When one speaks of America, wrote an Armenian correspondent in 1891, one speaks of Worcester. A graphic account of the fledgling Armenian community was written by the Reverend Mr. Eldridge Mix, a congregational minister, and it appeared in the Worcester magazine in 1902. Among them are many who are in their native land of high social standing, well educated, and possessors of considerable property. They are among the best representatives of their race. Since coming among us stripped of all they owned of the world's goods, they have at once taken whatever offered in the way of employment. And many of them are at work in our factories. Others have opened little shops of their own, and among them are to be found doctors, lawyers, musicians, photographers, and architects who will take up their respective callings as the way opens. Well, for many, the way never did open, but for others, Worcester was a stimulus to a greater and more abundant life. And of course, the most illustrative example of the latter is the story of Dr. Barastad Hovannes Kazanjan, who arrived penniless in Worcester in 1895 at the age of 16, and who worked in the wire mill, of course. He became first a dentist, graduating from Harvard Dental School in 1905. But during the First World War, he served as a surgeon in the British Royal Army Medical Corps, and he gained such renown for his skill in treating the shell-shattered faces of the British soldiers that he was named the Miracle Man of the Western Front. And he was knighted by King George V. And later, of course, he became the father of modern plastic surgery. Worcester became a way station for many Armenians. For example, the early settlers of Fresno, California, first settled in Worcester and then went there. Worcester became the hometown of American Armenians, just as Plymouth, Massachusetts, became the hometown of American Yankees. The first organization in Worcester was the Illuminatorian Education Union of Husinec, founded in 1882 for the purpose of raising money to send back to their little village to support the village school and church. The number of immigrants from this little village of 3,500 Armenians was so great that the Reverend James Barton, president of Euphrates College, was complaining, "From Husinec, over 200 are now in the United States, and fully as many more are ready to start." With the appearance of leaders and intellectuals, an Armenian club or academy was formed in 1888, with a membership of eventually 200. Leadership was assumed by a Mugadich Topanelian, who had arrived from Constantinople in 1884, and Mugadich Portakalian, an eminent educator who wrote, was a worker for the nation. It was Portakalian who had been the editor of the newspaper Armenia, which was published in Marseille. An able spokesman, he said, "Wherever the Armenians have gone, they have brought with them their Armenian churches, the Armenian press, and Armenian schools, and that national trinity has graced them with prosperity and saved their national existence from all alienating forces and unfavorable circumstances which they faced." And certainly their circumstances were unfavorable. But they found a spokesman at last in some of these educated Armenians, particularly Mugadich Topanelian. Notwithstanding their drab existence, there were moments of humor. The story is told of one Armenian worker at the wire mill whose wife had made Armenian meatballs, kuftas. But hers were much larger than the usual, more the size of oranges. Excuse me. And as he proceeded to get on the trolley, the bag broke, and the meatballs went flying down Laurel Hill, clunkety-clunk, and it caused such a furor that the people started screaming, "The Armenians are bombing us!" and throwing cannonballs at us. And actually the police were called in this particular incident. Well, of course, the first thought of the Armenian club was to build churches. They had to demonstrate to the natives that they were Christians. And they appealed to the Armenian Patriarch of Constantinople, stressing their need for a spiritual leader. There are 300 Armenians in Worcester and about 400 scattered in New York, Boston, Jersey City, and Philadelphia, they wrote. And in response, the Patriarch dispatched the Very Reverend Hofsep Sarajan. On July 28, 1889, this celebrated priest celebrated an Armenian apostolic service in the first Armenian apostolic service in America in Worcester, Massachusetts. Interestingly, the Worcester Telegram, which recorded these events with such clarity, reported the event when it said, "Father Sarajan arrived in Worcester several days ago from his native land and appears in the street in his odd-fitting priestly robes and queer-shaped purple velvet head cover. He has been duly appointed priest of America, and while his home will be in Worcester, he will answer calls from Boston, New York, Jersey City, Newark, Chicago, and San Francisco, to which cities he will, when requested, pay brief visits." Well, his parish, like the circuit-riding preachers of early colonial days, was the vast continent between Boston and California. And within a year, a board of trustees was elected whose primary concern was the construction of a church. And in February 2nd, 1890, they resolved, whereas the Armenian people, by reason of persecution and abject poverty, are immigrating to America, in order to preserve these immigrants from being alienated, we hereby decide to build a church. And we direct the Very Reverend Hofsep Sarajan to undertake the necessary negotiations for that purpose. Well, since many Armenians lived on Laurel Hill, a lot was purchased at 61 to 65 Laurel Street, and by Armenian Christmas, on January 18, 1891, the church was consecrated. Named the Church of Our Savior, it was built at a cost of $9,500. They had an interesting way of collecting money. And they solicited money from all over America. They would simply address a letter to Mr. John Armenian and send it to every city, Detroit, Chicago, New Orleans, in the hope that the postmaster would deliver the letter to the first Armenian he ever met. But this worked because from New York City alone, they collected $694.75. Well, you see, it was a good idea. Well, by 1897, the first Armenian woman arrived in Worcester with the consent of the Sultan of Turkey. And it was such important news that the Worcester Evening Post gave it front page coverage in an article entitled "Two Women of Armenia." And the Reverend Eldridge Mick noted about this woman arriving, until 5 years ago, there was not more than 8 or 10 among them in the entire city. However, within itself, and for the entire first decade, the Armenians in Worcester were beset with severe internal strife and difficulties, which at times led to violence. The political situation in the Caucasus was transferred to central Massachusetts and centered on the issue of political discussions within the church. And there are several issues of the Worcester Telegram which, in very glaring headlines, give it credence to this. But as a consequence, Father Sarajan tendered his resignation. Another issue of concern had to do with the Armenian coffee houses, which were springing up in several places. They were frequented by the bachelors and were reputed to be dens of iniquity and gambling. Nonetheless, the Armenians had a reputation as a people for very seldom appearing in police courts. There wasn't a single Armenian lawyer until the first quarter of the 20th century had passed. And in 1889, the control of the church organization in America was transferred to Dekmejian, and Worcester was designated by the then reigning Catholicos, His Holiness Kaprielian Haile, as the diocese of the entire Armenian Church of America. And returning to Worcester, the very Reverend Hostep Sarajan was consecrated a bishop and appointed primate of the newly created diocese. By then, Worcester's population had reached 1,000. And of course, after 1895, return to Armenia was virtually impossible, and as a result, the immigrants became more involved in local issues. And the Worcester City Directory of 1900, for the first time, lists an Armenian club, and it was the Armenian Bicycle Club, which they organized among themselves. And the Reverend M. Seropian published the Armenian American Annual Address in 1912, and although most of the early arrivals in Worcester worked in factories, some did not. For example, Sarkis Sarapian was a moneylender, and K.B. Tomajan, as early as 1890, was a dealer in men's furnishings and a financial broker. And in 1900, the first factory to manufacture boulders, or cracked wheat, was established in Worcester by Armenians. In a story, all its engrossing own, the Protestant community traces its origins to 1881, to those prayer meetings which were held in the Yazidian home. The number of Protestant Armenians were disproportionately large in the migration, Dr. Mirak has written. That is, Protestant Armenians in Worcester comprised perhaps 3% of the population, yet upwards of 20% of the Armenian immigrants were Protestants. And these immigrants were better educated than the Orthodox because of the large numbers of missionary-educated students and teachers in the migration. All in all, the movement to America owes much of its character to Protestant missions, as the Armenian Protestants were a large factor in the exodus. And as the number of immigrants increased, the Protestants moved to a chapel on Summer Street. And in 1892, they organized themselves into a church body with the assistance of the Missionary Association of America. And the Badveli Hachadur Beneyan came to America in 1896 to study psychology and preached. And 2 years later, it was decided to build a church building. And it was named the Church of the Martyrs in memory of those lost during the massacres. And with a congregation of 150 in 1900, the church was built at a cost of $8,000, with Armenians donating $2,000 of this money, and the remaining $6,000 was donated by the citizens of Worcester. Notwithstanding the rivalry they endured, the Protestant community, Dr. Mirak again has reported, more successfully fulfilled its New World mission. Mark Yeskian, in his master's thesis, The Political Behavior of First-Generation Armenians, reported that at the beginning of the century, the Armenians in Worcester were at first cohesively Republican. My father and all our friends were Republicans, the early immigrants remember. The factory hands were admonished by their bosses, if the Republicans don't win, the shops and factories will close. And they loved Theodore Roosevelt, with whom the Reverend Garabed Manavian, who had followed Badveli Beneyan in 1904 as pastor of the Church of the Martyrs, had a very close personal friendship. Now, why did the Armenians choose this city, this small city, as their chief city in America? It was one of the most heavily industrialized cities in America, producing a diversity of products and offered much unskilled employment. The salaries were relatively higher than elsewhere. By train, it was easy to reach from New York, and when they arrived, they were assured of a job and a place to stay in an Armenian setting. And since 1826, when the Irish arrived to work on the Blackstone Canal, Worcester had wide experience with immigrants. It was the home of at least 3 American missionaries in Turkish Armenia in the 1880s and 1890s, the Reverends Hitchcock, Knapp, and Dr. Usher. Well, the Reverend Mix stands out as a friend of the Worcester Armenians. In 1902, pleading on their behalf, he said, in their native land also, Worcester is held in honor as their chief city in the New World, and for what it has done on their behalf. They will always stand for its good name, and the future of our city, so far as they are concerned, is safe. Let us receive them, he pleaded, with a welcome, a richly deserved welcome, a brotherly hand, and a kindly aid that they so fittingly need for citizenship with us, and a generous recognition of their worth and worthiness so fully exhibited, thoroughly tested, and abundantly proven in their past history. If I were to give in a concise form the story of the Armenians in Worcester, I would choose the names of the first churches. The Church of the Martyrs, for not only did they come to Worcester as a consequence of martyrdom in Turkey, but literally and figuratively, the early settlers were martyred in America. And secondly, the Church of our Savior. The establishment of this church was indeed the savior of the early immigrants. They had established their roots and asserted their Christian identity, and in so doing, they had achieved a sense of dignity which continues to this day.
Thank you very much, Dr. Deranian, for that interesting and informative talk. We move now from Worcester to the communities of the mid-Atlantic states, focusing on New Jersey. Because while Worcester, as Dr. Deranian so well pointed out, while Worcester was industrializing, the process of industrialization was very active throughout New England and the mid-Atlantic states. And it was this process which, feeding on immigrants coming into this country, which was to permit settlements and encourage settlements in the various communities. So from Worcester, which began the process, we now move to New Jersey, and to a talk by Gary Kulhanjian, who is eminently qualified to talk about the topic. I've had the pleasure of knowing him for a number of years. He's educated at East Tennessee State University, at the Patterson College of New Jersey, and at Rutgers University. He is a full-time teacher in the public school system of New Jersey, and in addition to trying to educate the great herds of illiterate there, he has been active in Armenian topics and has done a number of important pieces, one of which is an abstract of the historical and sociological aspects of Armenian immigration, which has been cited prominently. He's co-authored a book on the Armenians in the New Jersey ethnic experience, and he has currently an article in the Encyclopedia of the USA, which is in the process of publication. So it's a great pleasure to welcome him to our panels of Gary Kulhanjian.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mirak, and I want to thank the NAASR staff for inviting me today. It's very difficult to begin without saying a few personal things, and that is in standing here to remind myself as well of the immigrant experiences that I heard as a child, and being a product of an Armenian home and Armenian parents who immigrated to this country as a result of the Armenian genocide. It gives me a great deal of humility and understanding, hopefully, of the past, and I hope that I could share some of that with you this morning. From Ararat to America, the Armenian settlements of New Jersey. The legacy of Armenians in America is now nearly 100 years old. The Armenian community of New Jersey was one of the earliest established settlements of the North American continent. In the urban areas of the Northeast, the population of Armenians was concentrated in Massachusetts, New York, and New Jersey. The Armenian community migrated to Fresno, California, which was unlike other regions by the early 1900s. The Armenian settlements in New Jersey were established before the Armenian genocide of 1915. This state had always been the crossroads for immigrants from different lands, and it attracted immigrants because of industrial settlements and rich farmlands. Many immigrants traveled across the state since it was close to New York's port of entry and other metropolitan areas like Philadelphia. The railroads linked the state to faraway places in the Midwest, where immigrants were needed for both industrial and agricultural labor. Immigrants were also brought from the Castle Garden, Ellis Island to Bayonne, Jersey City, West Hoboken, Union City. These cities were located near the Hudson River and were important points of entry for immigration officials. In New Jersey, the Armenian settlements developed demographically in Jersey City, Newark, Patterson, and West Hoboken, Union City. These cities were major areas where Armenians resided at the beginning of the 20th century. The fervent eruption of immigrant communities is the central theme of this study. Hence, this phenomenon was not typical of Armenian settlements alone. Immigrants were migrating from many parts of Europe and other locations at the same time. Each group had their own reasons for making the long journey across the Atlantic, which paved their way toward freedom and security. The historical record herewith will be divided into three sections. The Armenians who came to New Jersey shall be reviewed by their settlements. The time period 1890 to 1945 was relevant to the study. The second section pertains to the unique aspects of the settlers and their work within each community. The emphasis is on various cultural and religious developments of the new immigrants. The final section will emphasize areas of New Jersey where Armenians played a prominent role but not within their ethnic communities. The social, economic, and political needs of each community varied but were an integral aspect of the immigrants' goals. The questions of why and how immigrants settled in New Jersey adds to the unknown story of their experiences. The article reviews the earliest Armenian settlements. Each settlement adds a unique dimension of the immigration story. Newark was the smallest Armenian community. In the Newark settlement, Armenians were not concentrated in any one area but were scattered in neighboring communities. Armenians were found in the Oranges, Belleville, Bloomfield, Montclair, etc. Perhaps the closest estimate of their population in Newark and its environs was 150 families. Of the 34 nationalities of Newark by 1916, the Armenians were counted in the school population along with the Greeks, the Syrians, who came from Turkey. From Turkey, the list of students included a total of 48 who were Armenians, Syrians, and Greeks. The record showed Newark had the minutest Armenian school population compared to other immigrant groups and settlements. The Armenians were involved in unique trades and businesses in Newark. The Newark Armenians organized an independent parish in 1926. It was May 16, 1926 that the first Armenian church service was held in Newark. Mayor Raymond was invited to attend the service along with other dignitaries. The Armenian clergymen and choir were assisted by Episcopal bishops of Newark and other New Jersey dioceses. Despite the heavy rain, over 1,000 attended the Armenian service in Grace Episcopal Church, with the primate of the Armenian Church in America, the Archbishop Tiran Nersoyan, officiating. The service was conducted by the Archbishop in the ancient Armenian language. A friend of the Armenians was the Reverend Marshall F. Montgomery of St. Barnabas Episcopal Church, who publicly praised the Armenians for their unwavering devotion to Christianity despite their perils and misfortunes throughout history. The Reverend Montgomery was the son of missionary parents who served the Armenians in Turkey. Reverend Montgomery delivered the sermon in English and Armenian. The House of Prayer Church was used by the Armenians from 1938 to 1949 on Broad Street in Newark. Finally, the late 40s, the Newark Armenians acquired a church, and it was dedicated to the name of St. Mary. Over 250 guests from New York City, Patterson, Union City attended the first service. The St. Mary Armenian Church was located on the corner of 14th Avenue and Grove Street in the town of Irvington. The Armenians entered Newark by 1920, but their numbers were very small compared to other foreign-speaking groups. They were part of the city's 214,094 citizens who used foreign languages. The number of citizens born in the city to use English was 200,122. The Armenian image in Newark was characterized in the following way in 1938. Quote, "The Armenians are a hospitable folk, and it is a hurried visitor who isn't treated to a cup of steaming sweet Eastern coffee." A typical Armenian citizen of the city, Oscar Aslanian of 614 Broadway, delights in entertaining a group of friends under his own vine and beech trees, donning his old costume and fez for the fun of it, unquote. By the advent of World War II, Arshela Gorky was known figure for the Newark airport murals. Gorky's work produced a monumental 10-panel, 1,530 square foot mural called The Evolution of Forms Under Aerodynamic Limitations, Enrichment of New Jersey's History. Gorky's inspiration, mural painting, touched New York City's new school for social research prior to the Newark Airport venture. He was responsible for mural projects in front of the Aviation Building at New York's World Fair in 1939 and a famous nightclub in Fort Lee, New Jersey called the Riviera. Paterson, New Jersey became the heart of the silk industry of the 1900s. Immigrants from many different parts of Passaic were attracted to Paterson. The immigrants were plagued with intergroup conflicts. Immigrants fought against each other since there were a small number of silk mills which permeated strikes. Armenian immigrants alienated other older immigrant groups by acting as strike breakers. During the late 19th century, Armenians were employed in building railroads, the silk mills, the wool industry. At Sterling, the silk mill attracted 900 foreigners of diverse ethnic origins, including Armenians, Italians, and Swedes. By the mid-1930s, the Armenian community of Paterson developed a sizable community to purchase of the Episcopalian Church of Bloomfield Avenue off of Main Street. It was the children of this community who later developed the St. Leon Armenian Church of Fairlawn. Besides working in the silk mills, Armenian merchants began opening small tailor shops, groceries, and rug shops in Paterson. The main cultural island of the Armenians in Paterson was located at Main Street to Crooks, Getty, and Pacific Avenues. Some of the Armenian proprietors who lived in Paterson community were known outside their settlements. These hardy immigrant merchants were known by their family names: the Gamarikians, the Nakashians, the Norigians, and the Tilbians. The first Armenian rug merchant in Paterson, New Jersey was an immigrant by the name of Haratun Nakashian. His store was located at 253 Park Avenue. Nakashian was from Urfa, Turkey. He learned to work with rugs in New York City in 1913 while working for the Gulbenkian Rug Company. He later married Duruhi Kamyan, and they had two sons, John and Karnik Jack. Later, the business name was changed to H.H. Nakashian and Sons of Fairlawn, New Jersey. People who came from neighboring towns to the Nakashian brothers to purchase rugs. The Avedasian rug plant in Nutley, New Jersey, prior to the Nakashian business, developed in northern New Jersey. It was the Avedasian plant which used the chemical wash process to mercerize rugs. A visitor would find Armenians living in a small section of Paterson. Many spoke of old country experiences, especially in the grocery shops, which carried many spices and foods by Middle Easterners. It was also an area near Hobart Mansion where non-Armenians would witness Captain James Chankalian training and practicing maneuvers on Garrett Mountain with other Armenians. Garrett Hobart was the former Vice President of the United States under President William McKinley. Chankalian's intention was to train Armenian Americans and return to Turkey to retake their homeland. It was in the area of where the Chankalian trained the troops that Armenians of South Paterson needed a medical doctor. The most popular medical doctor of the Armenian community was Dr. Hago Beshlin of 7 Lee Place, who was also from Urfa, Turkey. Perhaps few Armenians in New Jersey knew of the brave courage of this medical doctor and his experiences in the Ottoman Empire. The Armenian community of Paterson started church services beginning in 1898. The Armenians utilized other churches until 1934 when services were held at St. Luke's Episcopal Church at 135 Bloomfield Avenue. They later purchased the building until they consecrated and renamed it St. Leon Armenian Apostolic Church in 1941. The St. Leon Church was remodeled in accordance with Armenian architecture. It was during the pastorate of Archbishop Mamre Kalfayan that sections of the church were restored for aesthetic reasons. The Archbishop Karakin Hosepian, primate of the Eastern Diocese of America, officiated the service of the consecration and named it St. Leon Armenian Church. The massive migration of Armenians to New Jersey began actually in 1894 and 1895, following the Turkish massacres by the Red Sultan Abdul Hamid. The earlier vanguard of immigrants from Dekmejian arrived a few years earlier. The immigrants who left their families sought their wealth in Jersey City. They were attracted by the silk weaving industry. These men were all silkworm growers in Dekmejian. Most of them were birds of passage who wanted to earn enough money to return to their families overseas. Mugardich Chankalian, who settled in Jersey City, was one of the earliest settlers. After months of hardship, he was employed by the Gebinard silk mill. Unlike his countryman, Mugarditch Chankalian's goal was to remain in the United States. In 1888, he sent for the remainder of his family after living in the United States. Arriving in America beside his wife Lucia, he brought 3 sons and 2 daughters after him. Among his family was James M. Chankalian, a son, who later became an Armenian-American hero. The Armenians resided in South Street near Summit Avenue, Jersey City. Some Armenians, including Mugarditch Chankalian, left the Gebinard mill for a new factory. The new factory was built in 1888 by the Schwarzenbach Huber Company on 1.5 acres in West Hoboken, Union City, located on Height Road and Bergerline Avenue. Subsequently, many Armenian families moved to West Hoboken. The silk industry in the 1880s brought clipper ships to the shores of the Palisades of New Jersey. From the ports of New Jersey, these ships opened trade to the Orient. Railroads from many parts of the United States were connected to the cities of New Jersey. The railroads carried supplies and immigrants from cities along the industrial eastern seaboard. Women's liberation had its origins in the silk mill, since many women worked alongside of their husbands. Children were also hired under the age of 15. The Armenians held religious services for a time in the 1890s under the guidance of the New Jersey Presbytery. The Christian mission was established under the leadership of a Reverend Bedros R. Torosian, who was a relative of the Chankalian family. Reverend Torosian was also a native of Diyarbakir, Armenia, who graduated from Union Theological Seminary in New York City. He was also appointed to be the superintendent of the Armenian Union Settlement Organization, which would help relocate immigrants in the area. The minister was later ordained in the Armenian Apostolic Church. The word Dardanelles appeared in the records of Hudson County, New Jersey, consisting of 5 blocks in an area of West Hoboken and Central Avenue. From Oak to Angelica Street lived 19 different nationalities. The area was settled by Armenians who prospered in various small businesses. They were involved in diverse industries, which was apparent by the production of artificial flowers to the manufacture of fire escapes. The Armenians were proprietors in the manufacturing of jewelry, carpet, and rug industries. The Armenian businessmen in West Hoboken were Bohas sons, Boyajian sons, Boas Furian, Thomas Obenisian, and others. Miran Kostikian, Garabed Mikhailian were well known in the carpet and rug industries. The Dardanelles was predominantly occupied by the Armenians, Greeks, and Syrians. The Armenian colony of New Jersey originally was settled in 1884. The original 8 settlers who were immigrants were Dr. John Toprahanyan, Kevork Nakian, Charles Sarifian, Haigazi Guinyan, Jacob Banajian, Jacob Toprahanyan, Paul Ajamian, and Mugarditch Chankalian. These men had a number of distinctions. They were mostly from Dekmejian. However, the community record showed no one can be positive who the first Armenian immigrant was in New Jersey. In a yearbook published in 1912 in Boston by Bishop Musig Serobian, the first Armenian immigrant to New Jersey was Hagop Izgian, who established a rug factory in Jersey City Heights on the border of West Hoboken by about 1870. He immigrated from Marash in 1867, followed by 4 brothers. Even earlier, the Plank Road Company built a road from Florence to Union City in Monmouth County, nearest Keyport, New Jersey. It was from the Bayshore area that a steamer called Armenia was chartered to run from New Jersey, Raritan Bay area to New York. Perhaps an Armenian was involved in the shipping industry that a steamer was named Armenia in 1852. Evidence in the steamer case was vague to verify the existence of Armenian settlers. By 1911, it was estimated that 20,000 Armenians came to the United States. Many of these immigrants settled in New Jersey, which was accessible to steamers and ferry boats. In 1911, the town of West Hoboken celebrated its Golden Jubilee. People of different nationalities paraded with exuberance, wearing the costumes of their ancestral homelands. The Armenians also participated in the gala celebration. The Armenians also selected Peter Fernandjan, who volunteered to be General of Artan, but the horse he was riding got so frisky he had to walk the remainder of the parade. In the early The early immigrants labored in the silk mills, but were unable to continue the silk mills in the mid-20th century. They were attracted to dry cleaning, tailoring, watchmaking, shoemaking, etc. The immigrants who were able to attend colleges strove to become doctors and lawyers. The Holy Cross Armenian Church of West Hoboken, Union City was opened on January 27, 1907. The Armenian immigrants were attracted to the community because of the availability of work and attractive church setting along the Palisades overlooking New York City. Prior to the Holy Cross Church being built, plans were made by the Bishop Josep Sarajan, the first Armenian primate of North America. By 1900, the Armenians arranged to have their first church services. In the building of West Hoboken Church, the bishop insisted that the church be built under his tutelage. However, there should not be any recreation hall in the church. He did not want the church to be a meeting place for political parties and their affairs. Not far from the Schwarzenbach Silk Mill was the Swiss Tern Hall. This hall was a primary gathering place where Armenians had their functions until after World War II. Contests were held at Nipovodas Hall, which was once known as Monastery Street. The young men of the Hudson County community sponsored picnics and featured an Armenian boxer from Brooklyn, whose name was Marty Terzian. He was referred to by the boxing fans as Kid Troy. He was a red-headed fellow who sometimes fought under the alias name of Marty Taylor. This high-spirited boxer may have been the first Armenian boxer in America, and perhaps the last. The Armenians of Hudson County established the first Armenian newspaper in the United States in 1888. The Ararat Sun was published in Jersey City by Haigaz Nguyenyan. Later it went on to be called Suratag Messenger and later Azadun Freedom. Several Armenians who started prominent businesses from Union City and Jersey City. James Chankalian, who was a famous hero of Cilicia, was the founder of the Powers Photo Engraving Company in New York. The Chankalian family lived in Patterson, Totowa, West New York, West Hoboken. The Chankalian sons were first employed by the Union Photo Engraving Company in New York, and when they joined the 7th Corps in the Spanish-American War, they met the Powers brothers, and after the war established their own photo engraving business. The records indicate that 75% of the Armenians in New Jersey between 1910 and 1912 lived in Hudson County. About 50 years ago, there were 12,000 Armenians residing in Hudson County, New Jersey, 2,000 in Bergen County, 3,000 in Essex County, 3,000 in other parts of the state. Union City, West Hoboken had 5,000 Armenian residents, 3,000 in West New York, 2,000 in North Bergen, 1,000 in Jersey City, and the rest scattered in Weehawken, Hoboken, Secaucus, Bayonne, Guttenberg, East Newark, Harrison, and Kearney. The Hudson County Armenians were nearly all from Diyarbakir, Armenia, about 99% of them. As a result of this demographic phenomenon, the Armenians started a compatriotic society, the Compatriotic Society of Diyarbakir. The founder of this organization was Diran Siglian, who was editor of Tigris, who helped compile much of the history of the community. But the historian of the community was Garabet Ajemian, whose son perhaps became the first Armenian American politician in New Jersey. His name, Edward J. Ajemian, from Hudson County, 1938, 37-38. The men from Dikran Ager immigrated first. It was not always possible to move, for everyone to move in the family. Among means of leaving Turkey before the Armenian genocide was to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and use the excuse of becoming a Haji. The Turks did not question this technique since they made pilgrimage to Mecca as other Muslims in their lifetime. 75% of the Armenians who came to America settled in Hudson County in the pre-World War I days. According to the record, 13.4% of the Armenians settled in Patterson and Essex County. The Armenians controlled the Oriental rug industry in the United States and the photo engraving business. They also were in control of the pistachio nut industry by the Norian brothers of New Jersey. The Armenians who settled in New Jersey were mostly urban dwellers. They first worked in the factories but soon moved into small businesses. These early immigrants also were prominent in various industries. The greatest economic contribution Armenians made to the nation was a factory for a rug company in Freehold, New Jersey, and it was the A.M. Karaguzian rug plant, the largest in the state Ironically, this huge firm created by two brothers, Miran and Arshad Karaguzyan, was not established in a major industrial city of New Jersey. The home of the Gulistan carpet was Freehold, New Jersey. The other firm was located at Roselle, New Jersey. Freehold, New Jersey was an agricultural town, but the Karaguzyan plant eventually took over the town. The carpet industry became the only major business of Freehold. The small city boomed in the heart of rural Monmouth County. The plant employed 2,000 people at one time and flourished about 50 years ago. Freehold became a major link between New York and New Jersey. The city's earliest history was distinguished by its having been the site of the Battle of Monmouth during the American Revolution. The city was brought into the 20th century by the Karaguzyan Rug Company, joined by other American companies. The Karaguzyans first purchased the Rothschild shirt factory in Freehold in 1904 and began importing rugs from Europe. By 1923, they began making their own carpets and established a plant in Roselle. They gained a world reputation by having the honor of having the first rug being placed in the United States Supreme Court building and the Radio City Music Hall. They also produced thousands of miles of duck cloth for gun covers, tarpaulins, tents, and bomb linings, but the secret weapon that was produced in World War II by the Karaguzyan rug plant was radar. This was a very important contribution to the war effort. Armenian intellectuals studied in New Jersey, but were not part of the settlements. Many 19th century intellectuals turned to their homes overseas. A few who remained in the United States served the Armenian church or became ordained as Protestant ministers. Some students went into the medical and legal professions. The most transient of all immigrants were the intellectuals. They were mostly males who had formal training elsewhere before their New World experiences. Many of these intellectuals were found at numerous theological seminaries and Ivy League colleges. A handful of Armenians who studied in New Jersey were located at Princeton and Princeton Theological Seminary in the 1880s and early 1900s. There were Mangasar Mangasaryan, Musig Minasyan, Samuel Melkonyan, Andon Kazanjan, Alan Tikirian, and others. The most prominent scholars were Mangasar Mangasaryan and Musig Minasyan. Briefly, Mangasar Mangasaryan, born in Moshkvit, Turkey, he was educated at Robert College before entering Princeton Theological Seminary. The young scholar had a gift to move masses of people by his oratory. He spoke from New York to San Francisco on several occasions. He, in a sense, is the Billy Graham of the Armenian Protestant theologians. He later turned to independent religious society, humanism. Clara Barton, who was the founder and president of the American Red Cross, visited the Near East to aid the survivors of the Armenian massacres of 1896. Miss Barton was accompanied by his secretary, George Pullman, and a young Armenian by the name of Musig Minas Minasyan, studied at Princeton Theological, earning his undergraduate and graduate degrees. He was the chief dragoman for Clara Barton when she ventured into aiding the interior Armenians of Turkey. Her interpreter was a man of many talents. Clara Barton wrote Minasyan a note on December 4th, 1896, acknowledging her gratefulness to him for his work and association in a far-off land. Another one of those intellectuals was Bedros Kevork Apelyan. Was born in Kaseb, Turkey. His family suffered from the Turkish persecutions. He served the American Committee for Armenian and Syrian Relief. 1921, and by 1936, the Reverend Apelyan was called to the ministry of the Church of Radburn, a Protestant American church in which he served for over 21 years. By the Roaring 20s, the Armenians were aware of the relaxation of the scenic shore area of New Jersey. Many tourists visited Asbury Park area, south of Long Branch and Sandy Hook. A few small families eventually purchased hotels, which attracted Armenians from afar. A few weeks at the shore area was relaxing. Perhaps the most important, or perhaps the most noteworthy hotel operator was John Kulhanjian. His guests referred to him as Uncle. Kulhanjian entered the hotel business in 1934. It was before the Kulhanjian venture that Armenians were preparing a play written by a famous writer, a great Armenian writer, Shirvanzadeh. The play Char Vokin, or the Evil Spirit. The New Jersey shore provided a relaxed atmosphere for the Armenian actors to rehearse. The New Jersey shore also attracted other prominent Armenians of the 1930s. Armin H. Babulian, who was a prominent influence in the development of penicillin in the United States. Unknown to the New Jersey Armenians and Americans, in fact, was a resident of New Jersey in Highland, New Jersey. His name, Haig Kavukchin. Arrival in New York in 1892 aboard the Boy of London was untypical of other immigrants who entered through the Ellis Island. He worked in the Oriental stores, rug stores in his youth before entering the photo engraving business. He organized the International Photo Engravers Union No. 1 and was one of the founders of the New York Board of Trade. The Bingham Photo Engraving Company, which was his firm, had a distinction of being the first to occupy the McGraw-Hill building in New York City. Kavukchin was married a few times. He later made a noteworthy contribution to the United States, New Jersey, and the Armenian community. During World War I, he raised money for Liberty bonds for the war effort. In World War II, he advocated a $1 a year slogan and raised enough money to contribute a PT boat. He was too old to serve in uniform, but made other contributions. In New Jersey, Kavukchin donated a baseball field for public use. He also was the police commissioner of Highland and was an elected official of New Jersey. He also was influential in a highway development system. He knew E. Donald Sterner, State Highway Commissioner in New Jersey. He helped develop Route 36 to the shore areas. Another unforgettable man was Samuel Hakimian of New Jersey. Born in Dekmejian, came to the United States and developed a cleaning business, later went into real estate, and he developed Hackensack, New Jersey, which attracted many Armenians to northern New Jersey, especially Bergen County, where many reside today. It was Hakimian who incorporated his business in 1934, and he attracted such businesses as Tom McCann, Franklin Simon, and other noteworthy national named businesses. Hakimian made a noteworthy contribution to the Armenian Home for the Aged, the Armenian Protestant Church, and the Armenian Apostolic churches that were developing. New Jersey had its share of American heroes who lived in the small towns and communities. James Chankalian, Dikran Nalbandian, Ashavir Shirajian, Dajat Dekmejian, and others. Among the Armenian Americans killed in action during World War II from New Jersey were Armin Atamian, Willard Bohujian, Robert Kalfayan, and John Kassian, and others. Perhaps those individuals who do not live in the Armenian settlements got the least publicity from the Armenian press. One such individual was Artie Gulamarian. Artie Gulamarian landed up in a tank corps with General Patton, who always referred to him as a good American. It had to do, of course, with his name Gulamarian. The New Jersey settlements were similar and dissimilar to other Armenian enclaves. The Armenians were established themselves after the massacres of 1890s in Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, etc., as far south as Virginia. They generally disliked working for others. These immigrants had a pioneer spirit for independence, and many developed their own small businesses. The Armenian settlements of New Jersey were also unlike their settlements in California. Many Armenians who settled in California were from the city of Kharpet in the old country. The Armenian settlers of New Jersey were mostly from Dekmejian. The New Jersey settlements were far more urban. The early Armenian immigrants who settled in New Jersey moved from one settlement to another within a short distance. California communities like Fresno were places where Armenian communities were far and isolated for a time. The Armenian immigrants who managed to arrive in the United States by the first half of the 20th century were traced to New Jersey. The motivation of the Armenians were not exclusive of others. However, their circumstances varied before the Armenian genocide of 1915. The Armenian settlements were discussed in this paper. The records show that by 1920, the number of foreign-born witnesses of Jersey City were classified as only 107 Armenians. The Armenians moved northward to Hudson County. The history has recorded the successful economic social mobility of Armenian immigrants. However, the Armenians never entered the mainstream of political life in New Jersey. Perhaps there were too many complex aspects of this neglect and dimension. But Armenians were too busy with old world politics. Since opportunities were limited in the political sphere for most of the new immigrants, they did not develop the political sophistication to enter politics in the New World. Upon owning his own personal property in the United States for over 25 years, one immigrant commented that only political needs the Armenians have is freedom and security. For the most part, political neglect in the New World led to a hampered image, although Armenians were always less in population than other groups. In concluding the immigration history of Armenian settlements in New Jersey, the records were scattered in various private and public institutions. The history herewith included the urban settlements, the economic development of the communities, the episodes of the early immigrants, and the social cultural dimension of Armenians in New Jersey. Smaller cities also attracted foreign-born immigrants, and Armenians were no exception. Freehold, Mendham, Princeton were also areas Armenians resided in the 19th century. However, the significance of this study has contributed to the gap of knowledge pertaining to the Armenian settlements of New Jersey. The story of Armenian settlements in New Jersey adds a new dimension to the legacy of their ancient progenitors who dwelled on the foothills near historic Mount Ararat and whose modern descendants immigrated to the shores of the New World. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kulhanjian. The names and the places and the occupations bring back so much nostalgia for work that many of us have done, and that was stimulating and interesting. It will stir some questions, I'm sure. We'd like now to take a break, but a short break, to bring you back with two more stimulating papers, and which we're all looking at now. On the early communities in Worcester and in New Jersey, we now move to two quite different topics, geographical and ethnic settings. The first of which deals with the Armenians of Canada, particularly in the first generation, in the period prior to World War I. And our first paper is by Isabel Kaprielian of Toronto on the topic of Bandought. Bandought being the immigrant, the wanderer, or the pilgrim. Isabel Kaprielian was born in Hamilton, so she is an Iragan Canadian Armenian. She has her degree from McMaster University in Hamilton, did graduate work at the University of London, and then completed her work just this spring at the University of Toronto with a distinguished piece of research for which she was awarded the PhD called Sojourners from Hrair, Armenians in Ontario to 1915. She has also been busy, in addition to raising a family, to other scholarly activities, and has produced a noteworthy publication which is available for sale here, called, and that's my plug, not hers, Armenians in Ontario, which is a superb publication of the Multicultural History Society of Ontario. If I may add a personal note, it was my pleasure to be asked to participate as the outside reader for Dr. Kaprielian's dissertation in Toronto about a month and a half ago, and all of the group who examined the dissertation were remarkably impressed by this remarkable piece of work, so it's, as I was. And so it's a great pleasure to welcome her and to hear her paper. Dr. Kaprielian.
Thank you, Dr. Mirak. I'd like to say that it's indeed a pleasure for me, a foreigner, to be here among you. Before World War I, at least 90%... Can you all hear all right at the back?
Can you turn up the microphone?
That's not a mic.
That's not a PA.
Okay, before World War I, at least 90% of the Armenian population of Brantford, how's that? What? Okay, Brantford, St. Catharines, and Hamilton, Ontario, was born in the district of Kulhanjian in Anatolia. These settlers came from similar economic, social, cultural, and political backgrounds, the majority being from the peasant class. They came to Canada not as immigrants, but as sojourners. By sojourner or Bandought, Hadith, I refer to those who left the village to work elsewhere with the intention of returning. Length of residence in the new location was largely irrelevant. As long as a man's heart, mind, and money were directed to the family back home, he could remain physically removed from his village for many years. This paper focuses on the group of Kulli peasants who migrated to Canada and gives an overview of their resettlement in the industrializing towns of southern Ontario. When I began this study, I assumed that Armenian community life in Ontario did not get underway until after the genocide, and that only a handful of guest workers had come to this part of North America before the First World War. From oral interviews, I learned, however, that the pre-1914 group was more numerous than I had anticipated and that it was more organized than I had expected. I was fortunate to gain access to existing pre-1914 minutes of 2 Armenian Revolutionary Federation branches and the records of 2 village educational associations. I then looked into local Canadian documents such as Anglican church registers, elementary school records, municipal property tax assessment rolls, a gold mine of information, city directories, cemetery, and court records. Canadian government files dealt extensively with Armenian immigration to Canada starting in the 1890s. Information about life in Kulli was difficult, depended primarily on reports by British consular officials and on a collection of material composed largely of published local histories, unpublished individual memoirs and biographies, as well as personal interviews with Kulesi. In the heart of Armenian life, Kulli, situated 40 degrees longitude and 3,200 feet above sea level, Kulli was a mountainous district in the province of Erzurum. It suffered from a scarcity of arable land, a short and dry growing season, and long, harsh winters. Most of the population were of the peasant class. The only town was Kulli Kasaba, the administrative, religious, and judicial center of the region. In 1911, it boasted a few schools, some craft and service shops, a handful of money changers, moneylenders, but it had no bank and no hospital. It is estimated that the population of Kulli in 1908 was about 60,000, 30,000 Armenians, about 25,000 Kurdish Shiites, and the rest Turkish civil servants and troops who were predominantly Sunni Muslims. By the late 19th century, corruption and violence had plunged the region into a state of abysmal insecurity and backwardness. Families groaned under the constant threat of famine and the pressure of brigandage, confiscation, exploitation, and exorbitant taxation. A British official reported, unarmed and helpless, the Armenians are at the mercy of armed brigand Kurds whose constant attacks upon Christian villages, coupled with exactions and barbarities, constitute an ever-existing ground for complaint. If the Christian peasants were adequately secured against the attacks and ravages of the Kurds, they would be as contented and loyal as they are naturally industrious. It was not only at the hands of the Kurdish outlaws and tribes that the Armenian peasants suffered. In Kulli, the government's attempts to regulate and the registration and certification of property led to notorious practices. Again, from a British consular report. During the registration, the Turkish beys offered their services to the villagers to get their fields legalized, carrying through the very complicated operations of registration and so on. The beys, however, after getting possession of the papers of the villagers, got them registered in their own names, dividing the property among themselves. The lawless beys also employed gangs of thugs who brutally struck down all who dared to resist them. The system of levying and collecting tithes and taxes provided still further opportunities for exploitation. Tithes were sold annually by auction to the highest bidder. After paying the government its share, the tithe farmer could collect and pocket any sum from the villagers in his jurisdiction. The legal tithes were about 11 3/4% of the produce, but the tax farmers often extorted as much as 25% of the harvest. and if the people could not pay, their property was confiscated or they were imprisoned. Appeals to civil and military authorities, whose job it was to protect the people, and attempts to redress wrongs before judges and investigators were usually futile. In many cases, the officials were in collusion with the Beys at the expense of the lower classes, or, intimidated by the wrath of such dangerous villains, authorities refused to take action against the Beys and the Allies. Periodic outbursts of peasant retaliation, extensive litigation, appeals to the Sultan, and even representation to the British embassy failed to alleviate conditions as the region degenerated into a state of disorder and anarchy. By such means, the Turkish Beys and Kurdish tribes gained possession of most of the arable land of Kuli. The villagers, on the other hand, lost the rights to the land they cultivated, slipped deeper into debt, or became sharecroppers and farm laborers. For Armenians, living conditions in the old country were difficult, but settled life did continue. In Kuli, the Armenians and the sedentary Kurds tolerated one another in a symbiotic relationship. There were thefts, murders, and reprisals on both sides. Men like Deranian were as feared by the Kurds as Ismail Bey was by the Armenians. For some Khalidis, the growing intensity of economic dislocation and violence and disorder in the region represented a motive for emigration, and they left if they could afford to buy their way out. For others, less well off or more attached to their patrimonial land, economic hardships reflected the need to bring in outside capital, and violence and disorder meant organizing more efficient measures of policing, self-defense, and mutual responsibility. The persistent disruption of the economy, culminating in the Kurdish rampages of 1895-96, drove men in growing numbers from the villages in search of outside capital to enable their families to make ends meet at home. As sojourners, they initially went to nearby urban centers such as Erzurum, Trebizond, and Constantinople, where they worked as porters, stevedores, and cooks. According to one interviewee, my grandfather lived in Boli for 35 years. He had gone there to work. His wife stayed behind. He would work and send money home. They would frequently go home during summer periods, father another child, and go back. The migratory circle progressively widened to include such foreign cities as Baku, Varna, and Cairo, and eventually expanded to cities on the eastern seaboard of the United States. On a trip through Kuli in 1911, Simon Gracian noted that the region was able to survive because of the sweat of the brow of 3,000 of its sons between the ages of 20 and 40 who were sojourning. That is 10% of the Armenian population of Kuli. Incoming capital enabled Armenians to repay debts, pay taxes, extend family property, and buy weapons and ammunition. The influx of capital into the village was accompanied by the penetration of foreign culture. Like the urban Armenian intelligentsia who were influenced by Western ideas and events when they studied abroad, and whose new and modern thinking affected the urban populations of the empire, the rural repatriates, in their own fashion, imported more than cash and technological advances. Having been touched by strange cultures, they too brought in new modes of thinking and behaving, and like the Protestant missionaries and the Armenian political parties, partially acclimatized the Khalidis to the ways of different worlds. Included in the Khalidsi world was a British colony in America, clean, Christian, civilized Canada. Those are not my quotes from their correspondence. But entry into the Dominion posed many problems. Based on the principle of racial superiority, Canadian immigration policy and laws showed a preference for settlers from the United States, the British Isles, and Western and Northwestern Europe. At the very bottom of the immigration hierarchical scale were Asiatics and blacks. Whether government officials defined Armenians as Asiatics on the basis of race or geography is unclear. What is evident is that as natives of Asia Minor and as Ottoman subjects, Armenians, even those from European Turkey, were discouraged from entering Canada and were often required to comply with the strict regulations governing Oriental immigration. By requiring every Asiatic man, woman, and child to have $200 in his or her possession, that is, 8 times as much as it cost them to get from England to America. Canadian immigration authorities used a regulation ostensibly aimed at curbing immigrant pauperism to obstruct the entry of undesirables. Like all immigrants, Armenians were subject to medical examination at the ocean port of entry. The long voyage, the exposure to unsanitary conditions in immigrant hostels and on shipboard weakened the immigrants. Some contracted trachoma or other contagious diseases and were accordingly rejected by port authorities. Now, while many Armenians entered Canada via ocean ports, an unknown number slipped across the U.S. border, especially at Niagara Falls and Detroit. Many of these immigrants entered illegally, especially after 1908-09, when the Canadian government prohibited entry of anyone who did not come by way of continuous journey from his or her country of citizenship, so that if they had stayed in the United States for a short period of time, they were excluded. Those who entered Canada believed that their greatest security was in factory labor. In all 3 cities, they worked in the foundries of the iron factories, such as the Pratt, Letchworth, Malibu Iron Works in Brantford. If the plant was slack, they worked on farms, on the rails, or in seasonal public works. But jobs, even in heavy industry, were not always readily available, so some factories discriminated against foreigners. Recalled an informant. The Westinghouse didn't like to hire foreigners, but the International Harvester was good. It didn't care if we were foreigners. It gave us jobs. As common laborers, Armenians earned around 10 cents an hour, worked 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. As a rule, Armenians aspired to be molders, partly because of the status and partly because of the wages, since they would generally earn according to the number of molds they produced. Because they were regarded as hard workers, quote from one of the company employers, there was a standing order to give jobs to the Armenians. The foundries were hot and not so desirable, but the Armenians were industrious and prepared to work. In a poem to his village people, a young immigrant described his work. Now, if your money dropped into the fire of the Toniet, and you wanted to pick it out with your hand, think of how much trouble you would have to pick it out. That's how we earn our money over here. Informants have described the indelible physical scars of molders. Their hands were so tough, so callous, that you could stick a pin or knife in their hand and they couldn't feel it, said one. And they couldn't close their hands. When they wrote, you'd wonder how, because their thumb and first finger were an inch apart. They would walk to one side because the ladle they lifted was 75 to 125 pounds. And when they're doing that for 2 hours a day, they walk strange. Not only did the molders run the risk of injury as they carried their heavy ladles of hot molten iron from the cupola to their floor, but they also ran the risk of disease, especially silicosis. Their vulnerability was particularly evident when they were hurt or maimed. Beyond the help that they could render each other, they could expect no assistance from the companies, the state, or the Canadian community. At the factory, the Armenians were faceless men. In early company publications, they were not even mentioned. They stuck together and neither mingled with other ethnic groups nor joined in the company's social and sports programs. In order to keep a job and earn a decent wage, it behooved them to work diligently and at least to give the impression of docility. Their obedient behavior at the factory was in sharp contrast to their outspoken involvement in their own community affairs. Their caring world was the young wife they had left behind, or the aged parent struggling to maintain the familial possessions, or the brother trying to evade conscription into the Turkish army. Although the company dominated the work experience of these sojourners and dictated their periods and hours of employment and leisure, and imposed a new industrial discipline on them, It did not win their allegiance nor their loyalty. This is, of course, before 1915. The involvement in the labor union movement doesn't begin until the 30s. For the Armenians during these years, the iron factory was clearly not a way of life. Yet these sojourners were not irresponsible laborers. Most migrated to these towns with the intention of staying for a minimum of 3 or 4 years, and unless they were laid off, they usually stuck with the same job. Said one, whatever they took, they stuck to it. They didn't just jump from one place to another. Thus, to the extent that they remained in one city and worked in one factory, the Armenian sojourners composed a relatively stable working element, which contributed to the new industrializing culture, itself undergoing great changes. Aside from factory work, Armenians showed entrepreneurship by operating boarding houses, coffee houses, grocery stores, barbershops, and confectionaries. Some of these early businessmen brought their crafts and merchandising skills with them from the old country, while others simply took advantage of the new opportunities in the new environment. As we had lived in Armenian villages or in Armenian quarters in towns of the old country, Armenians in the New World clustered together. Initially, settlement was dictated by the workplace and by the proximity to amenities. In Brantford, for example, the Armenian settlement formed an arc in the heart of the city, following precisely the same arc created by the location of the factories where they worked. The Armenian quarter in St. Catharines was across the street from the McKinnon Dash and Metal Works, where almost all the Armenians worked. Kin, village, and political affiliation also influenced preferences within the general pattern of settlement. For instance, in St. Catharines, there was Vedita, where the Tashnaz lived, and Vadita, where the Hunchas lived. Research has revealed that in the period 1900 to 1915, at least 750 Armenian men, women, and children lived in Brantford. As to say, not that 750 lived there at one time, but 750 names were recorded in Armenian and Canadian sources. That's quite a number when you consider the population of Brantford in 1901 was only 16,500. The majority of early settlers were men without women, bachelors and young married men, who had come to America to work for a few years and returned to their homes with Canadian dollars. Before 1914, men usually lived in collectively organized boarding houses, the same as took place in the United States. Communal living was a tradition entrenched along with the tradition of sojourning itself. The Bandoughts in any big city, whether Bolis, Baku, Varna, Boston, lived communally. By living in Armenian boarding houses, the transient laborers could enjoy the camaraderie of their own people, eat their own food, share the nostalgia of home, save money for the family in the village, and facilitate their reinsertion in the home society. When the newcomer reached America, his kin and village people helped him find lodging and employment. Said one, they watched each other when they were here to make sure they didn't do the wrong thing. The boarding houses gave these men, conscious of shame and dishonor, the proximity necessary to exercise a certain measure of control over each other and to protect one another from the corruption of painted women, liquor, and gambling. That is not to say these were non-existent. They were, but this was some measure of control. The moral and social control was partially effective because each man knew the high price he would have to pay for nonconformity. The severest punishment for a newcomer was ostracism from his people. In the initial stage of Armenian settlement in Canada, their loyalties were still rooted in old world relationships, enmeshed in kin and village bonds. By means of letters and visits, they enjoyed a widespread network from the village to Bolis all the way to Brantford. They passed on vital information about jobs, family situations, living conditions, marriageable men and women, and in this manner retained and even strengthened old world ties and forged a strong migratory chain spanning half the world. Because their thoughts and sentiments were with their families still in the village, and because the sojourners were anxious to improve the education of village youngsters, villages in southern Ontario formed village educational associations to send funds and advice to the village school. When the Osnod Village Educational Association sent $1,000 to the village in the summer of 1908, the members reaffirmed their commitment to the village and also entrenched the village's dependence on them at the same time. Now this was a large amount of money, not usually, they didn't usually send $1,000. In fact, they were very careful how much they sent. Aside from their allegiance to their families and their villages, the Armenians were also loyal to their nation. By 1905, Armenians in southern Ontario looked either to the Armenian Revolutionary Federation or Tashnavs or the Armenian Social Democratic Party or the Hunchaks, or the Old Hunchaks, as vehicles in the preservation of Armenian identity, both in the homeland and in the diaspora. The primary concern of these parties was not the future of the ethnic group in Canada, but the fate of Armenia and the Armenians in the Ottoman and Russian empires. Their main interests were overseas. The events in Sussex, the Armeno-Tiger War, Constitution of 1908, Abdul Hamid's abdication, the Balkan War, conscription law. To help their country people, political parties raised funds, formed cells to train young men in the arts of self-defense, and mobilized them for the struggle at home. They opened reading rooms or kraftans to enlighten and politicize their members, encouraged self-improvement for men and women, and operated Armenian supplementary schools for their children. In fact, Armenian schools started as early as 1910. One of the most important functions of the political parties in southern Ontario in this early period was organizing, ordering, and regulating the community, an especially critical mandate in view of the absence of the church. It was the party's intention to discipline the men in their everyday life. Anxious to keep the peace among members, the parties held their own internal courts. Invariably, disagreements developed between the Tashnavs and the Hunchaks, even brawls. There seems to have been an attempt, however, to keep such conflicts within the Armenian community and not let it spill over into the Canadian milieu, because they tried to preserve the good name of Armenia and Armenians. On January the 24th, 1915, for example, members of the ARF in Guelph were instructed not to argue with the Armenian opposition in the presence of Canadians and to get along amicably with Canadians. Aside from establishing Armenian community patterns, the political parties also laid the foundation for intellectual traditions. Unable to sustain their own local press, the Armenians of southern Ontario imported their newspapers, books, and periodicals from Armenian publishers in the United States and Europe. Particularly popular were Hayrenik, Fatherland, and Yedigasar Hayastan in Armenia. By reporting and responding to the turbulent events which beset the Armenian people in the first 15 years of the century, the Armenian press in North America, particularly the political press, not only reflected the opinion of Armenians here, but also instructed them and directed their activities. Far from Turkish government censorship and violent oppression, the Armenian press blossomed in the fertile soil of the New World and left its imprint on the small Ontario colonies lying on the fringe of North American Armenian settlements. By informing the immigrants and involving them in the events of the old country, the Armenian American political press bound them mentally and emotionally to their homeland and kept them conscious of their old world loyalties. Accordingly, in 1910-11, the Hamilton and Brantford group sent official protests to Canadian officials on behalf of 500 Armenian political prisoners languishing in Russian jails, and together with Galt and St. Catharines raised almost $700 for the prisoners' defense. Isolated from the large Armenian settlements in the United States and outside the cultural and political framework of the Canadian host society, the Ontario Tashnavs and Hunchaks formed ancillary social and political organizations, such as Karatarans, women's groups, and Armenian language supplementary schools to bridge the distance to events in their homelands and to strengthen an Armenian identity in the diaspora. The Karatarans resembled the self-help and adult education efforts among other working-class people, such as the Mechanics Institute, the Arbeiter Rings, and the various Slavic Hospitas. Men of disparate educational backgrounds congregated in the reading rooms and exchanged ideas and experiences. The better educated assumed the responsibility of teaching illiterate comrades to read and write Armenian, and perhaps even a little bit of English. They undertook to familiarize their country people with Armenian history, politics, and literature. Itinerant priests from the American Diocese of the Armenian Apostolic Church in New York City were sent to meet the needs of the Canadian community. In their annual or biannual visits, these clergymen celebrated Armenian Mass and administered the rites of passage, usually in an Anglican church, sought out by the Armenians because of theological similarities with their own church. That these early migrants did not build their own Armenian church, Canada, before 1915, reflects not only their sojourner frame of mind, but the existence of other institutions and ways of being Armenian, which, although not anti-religious, did not require clergy or a church at the center of community life. To a degree, the Armenians who settled in southern Ontario before 1914 experienced the emotional difficulties associated with uprootedness and disorientation. Their emphasis on old world values and behavioral patterns was an effort to keep their ethnic consciousness alive in a new setting, partly to facilitate reinsertion into the home village society, and partly to give them comfort and strength. For many of them, however, another dimension existed. The Kulhanjians came from a remote area of Anatolia, but they were not isolated from modernity. Their world on the eve of migration included missionaries, repatriated migrants, intelligentsia, and the ideas they brought in. Perhaps little of this could prepare them for the real conditions of the malleable factory, but they should be seen as thinking and discreet men and women in the larger political and social world, not just silent drudges in the flow of labor to capital. They were people with a vibrant cultural and political life, and while slowly coming to grips with the Canadian environment, they continued to foster their old world traditions in the diaspora. Not that Armenians considered their culture superior to others. They recognized the great value of other cultures and tried to become familiar with them. As early as 1912, an Armenian petitioned the Hamilton Board of Education to start evening classes in English for foreigners at the local elementary school. But Armenians were determined to perpetuate their own ancient language and literature simply because it was theirs, because it was worthy of preservation, and because they feared it was on the verge of extinction. Neither the Armenians, nor their supplementary schools, nor their Kratarans, nor their political parties were viewed as threats to the predominant culture. British Canadians were not interested in Armenian efforts to establish and nurture schools and reading rooms. As long as this tiny minority worked hard, as long as its communities were relatively peaceful, and as long as its institutions were privately funded and administered, Canadians ignored the Armenian immigrants and did not obstruct Armenian efforts to create an ethno-verted world in Canada.
That was really very stimulating and called pioneering, opening up a new field. Our next and final speaker is on a topic that's non-Armenian and I think deserves some explanation. When we originally organized the conference, it was our thought to include speakers on topics dealing with non-Armenian ethnic groups as a comparative exercise. What happened was we had perhaps too many papers coming in from Armenians on Armenian topics which deserved attention, and so that made it difficult for us to include papers from scholars dealing with non-Armenian ethnic groups. However, this paper was so stimulating that we wanted very much to include it. In addition to Dr. Knapp's paper, we have tried to incorporate a non-Armenian or American perspective, or Canadian perspective, which was revealed in the